The morning of the rank ceremony smelled like pine smoke and nervous sweat, and Mara Voss had already decided she was not going to let any of it touch her. She stood in the infirmary at the back of the Ashvale Pack compound, folding bandages the way she had folded them every morning for the past 6 years. Her hands moved without thought. Fold, press, stack. Fold, press, stack. The rhythm of it was the only steady thing in a day that had already begun to crack at its edges. Outside the single small window above the supply shelf, she could hear the pack gathering. Voices layered over each other. Children ran across the courtyard, their footsteps fast and light. Somewhere near the main hall, someone was arranging chairs, the metal legs scraping against the stone floor in long, unpleasant drags. The sound made her jaw tight. She had been 22 years old for exactly 3 weeks. In those 3 weeks, she had treated a dislocated shoulder, 2 fever cases, 1 nasty gash along a warrior's forearm, and a young boy who had gotten a splinter so deep in his palm that he cried for an hour before she finally convinced him to let her take it out. She had done all of that without a title, without a rank, and without a single elder acknowledging that she had any business being as capable as she was. That was the thing about Mara. She was capable in a way that made people uncomfortable, because comfortable people liked their hierarchies clean. She was not supposed to be capable. She was supposed to be the girl with the unclear lineage, the girl the records described in 2 cold words that had followed her from childhood like a shadow she could never outrun. Lineage unclear. It was written in the Pack archive in the handwriting of Elder Doran, who had been 34 years old when he wrote it and was now 61, and still had not looked her directly in the eye in the years since. She had read that record herself, at 15, after breaking into the archive room with a hairpin and 15 minutes of patient work. She had not cried when she found it. She had felt something quieter than crying, something that settled into her chest like a stone dropped into deep water. She had replaced the file exactly as she found it, relocked the door, and gone back to her bed. In the morning she had gotten up and gone to the infirmary to learn how to set a broken finger, because if the Pack was not going to give her a future, she was going to build one herself out of whatever materials were available. That had been 7 years ago. Now she was folding bandages on the morning of the rank ceremony, which was the one day of the year when the Pack's entire social structure was made visible and official and public. Every member stood before the community. The elder pressed the verification seal to their wrist. Their wolf status lit up for everyone to see. Rank, tier, strength, lineage confirmation. It was supposed to be a celebration, a coming together, a reaffirmation of who they all were to each other. For Mara, it had always been the worst day of the year. You're going to wear the cotton off those bandages. She did not turn around. She knew the voice. Nina Carr, age 30, Pack healer and the closest thing Mara had to a mentor, leaned against the doorframe with a cup of tea in both hands, and the specific expression she wore when she was worried but trying to look like she wasn't. They needed refolding, Mara said. They were fine. They were uneven. Nina came into the room and set one of the cups on the shelf beside the bandage stack. Mara picked it up without being asked. The tea was too hot, but she held it anyway because the warmth in her hands gave her something to focus on that wasn't the sound of the chairs outside. You could skip it, Nina said. Mara looked at her. I know, Nina said. You're not going to skip it. I've never skipped it. I know that too. The thing about the rank ceremony was that it was not optional, not technically. The Pack charter, which was older than Elder Doran and his bad handwriting by about 200 years, stated clearly that all members of the Ashvale Pack over the age of 16 were required to present for the annual verification. Absence without documented medical cause was considered a breach of Pack loyalty. The penalty was a reduction in resource allocation, housing tier, food supply access, the small monthly stipend that kept Mara able to buy her own soap and medicine and the occasional book. She could not afford a reduction in resource allocation. She was already on the lowest tier. It will be over in 5 minutes, she said. It was what she said every year. Nina looked at her with the eyes of a woman who had watched Mara say that exact sentence for 6 consecutive years, and knew perfectly well that 5 minutes on that stone dais felt like considerably longer. Come find me after, she said instead. Mara nodded. She finished the tea. She finished the bandages. Then she went to put on the one good shirt she owned, because if she was going to be humiliated in front of the entire Pack, she was going to do it with a clean collar. The main hall of the Ashvale Pack compound was old enough that the wooden beams overhead had turned dark with age, and the stone floor held a cold that rose through the soles of your shoes no matter what season it was. The Pack had gathered in tiered rows on either side of the central aisle. At the far end, the stone dais held the verification seal on its iron stand, and Elder Doran stood beside it in his formal gray robes. his face arranged in the expression of solemn importance he wore every year. Mara took her place in the back row with the other low-tier members. She stood between a quiet older man named Owen who kept bees and rarely spoke, and a girl of 17 named Pen who was presenting for her first adult ceremony and was so nervous that she kept shifting her weight from foot to foot in a way that made the floorboards creak. "Stop moving," Mara said to her, not unkindly. "I can't help it," Pen whispered back. "What if mine doesn't light up?" "It will light up. But what if it doesn't?" Mara looked at the girl. Pen's wolf had been visible since she was 14, strong, steady, already showing the silver-blue edges of a tracker's lineage. There was absolutely nothing to worry about, but worry did not care about evidence. Mara knew that well enough. "Even if something goes differently than you expect," Mara said, keeping her voice low, "you will get off that dais, and you will still be yourself. That is the part that actually matters." Pen stared at her. Then she nodded slowly and stopped shifting her weight. Up at the front of the hall, the Pax Alpha began his opening address. His name was Calder Voss, and he was Mara's uncle by blood in the way that a signature on a legal document is a relationship, technically accurate and otherwise empty. He was a large man with a face that photographed well and a voice that carried to the back of every room he entered. He was very good at the ceremony. He was very good at most things that required looking powerful in front of an audience. Mara watched him speak and felt the familiar feeling she always felt when she looked at him. Not anger exactly. Not anymore. Something cooler than anger. Something that had been anger once, when she was younger, and had since compressed itself into something harder and smaller and much more durable. He did not look at her. He rarely looked at her. The ceremony began in rank order, which meant it began with the highest-tier warriors and proceeded downward. Mara had watched this enough times to track it without really paying attention. Each person walked to the dais. Elder Doran pressed the seal. The mark on their wrist glowed. Gold for high tier, silver for mid, white for the rest. People smiled. People embraced. Children cheered for their parents. It was, in its way, genuinely moving, if you were the kind of person who had a place in the structure being celebrated. Mara was not that kind of person. She watched Pen's turn come. The girl walked to the dais on legs that were visibly uncertain, held out her wrist, and then went completely still when the seal touched her skin, and the silver-blue light came up bright and steady. Pen made a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a laugh. The hall responded with warm approval. She walked back with her chin up and something in her shoulders that had not been there when she left. Mara thought, "Good," she thought. "Remember that feeling, because there will be days when you need it." The lower tiers went quickly. People she knew by name and ailment and the particular way they knocked on the infirmary door. Owen the beekeeper, who presented stoically and received his modest white glow without expression. A young warrior named Cal who could not stop grinning the entire time he was on the dais. 3 children presenting for the first time, all of whom cried immediately, which made the hall laugh in the fond way that people laugh when they are watching something small and genuine. Then Elder Doran's voice said her name. The hall went quiet. It was not a dramatic quiet. It was not the kind of quiet that happens when something exciting is about to occur. It was the quiet of people who have already decided what they expect to see and are settling in to watch it confirmed. Mara walked to the dais. She kept her pace even. She kept her face neutral. She had practiced both, and the practice showed, and she was glad of it. Elder Doran did not look at her directly when she stepped up. He looked at the verification seal. He looked at the assembled pack. He looked, briefly, at the ceiling, as if hoping for some form of divine assistance with what was about to happen. Then he pressed the seal to her wrist. Nothing happened. She had known it would be this way. 6 previous ceremonies. 6 years of the same result. She breathed slowly and waited for the standard 3 seconds that the elder always allowed before declaring the verification complete. 3 seconds passed. Elder Doran pressed the seal again, which he had never done before. Mara's eyes went to his face. His expression had changed, not in any large way, but she was very good at reading faces, and something in his jaw had tightened, and something around his eyes had gone careful in a way she did not recognize. He pressed the seal a second time. The hall was so quiet now that she could hear Owen the beekeeper breathing 3 rows back. Nothing happened on her wrist. But there was a warmth. Not on her wrist. Somewhere else. Behind her left shoulder. Under her shirt. Against the shoulder blade. A warmth that started small and then spread, not painfully but distinctly, the way heat spreads from a source, outward, steady, unmistakable. Mara reached up with her right hand and touched the back of her own shoulder. The shirt fabric was warm there. Genuinely warm, noticeably warm, as though she had been standing in direct sunlight for an hour. Elder Doran saw the gesture. Something happened in his face that she could only describe, later, as a man recognizing something he had been afraid of for a very long time. He stepped back. He actually stepped back. In 6 years and dozens of ceremonies, Mara had never seen Elder Doran step back from anything. He was not a man who retreated from difficulty. He was a man who managed it, smoothed it over, reduced it to administrative language and moved on. He did not step back. He stepped back. The hall watched. Mara stood on the dais with her hand against her own shoulder blade and a warmth that was now spreading down the left side of her back, and she did not understand what was happening, and she could see from the faces in front of her that most of the people in the room did not understand either, and this lack of understanding had a collective texture to it, not malicious, just wide-eyed and waiting. At the back of the hall, near the left side entrance, stood 3 people who had not been there when the ceremony started. 2 of them were sentinels. She recognized the form, the particular stillness, the way their eyes moved rather than their heads, the quiet readiness in how they held themselves. The third one she did not recognize. He was standing very still. He was looking at her. Not at the hall, not at Elder Doran, not at the pack assembled in their rows. He was looking at Mara, specifically and directly, with an expression that was not surprise. It was recognition. And Mara, who was standing on a dais in front of her entire pack with her hand pressed against a warmth she couldn't see, and an elder who had stepped away from her for the first time in 6 years, looked back at this stranger at the edge of the room, and felt something happen that she had absolutely no words for. The warmth behind her shoulder pulsed, once, like a second heartbeat. She lowered her hand. She held herself very still. Whatever this was, she was not going to let anyone in this room see it move her. Not Elder Doran, who had written 2 words about her mother and called it a record. Not Calder Voss at the front of the hall, whose face had gone white in a way she would examine later. Not the people in the rows who were watching with their mouths slightly open. And not the stranger at the back who was looking at her like he already knew exactly who she was, when she herself was only beginning. In this strange and suspended moment on a stone dais in a hall that smelled of pine smoke and winter, to suspect that she might not know who she was at all. She straightened her spine. She looked forward. She waited. Whatever was coming, she was going to meet it on her feet. The minutes that followed felt nothing like minutes. They felt like something thicker, like the moment before a storm when the air itself seems to hold its breath and everything becomes very precise and very loud at once. Elder Doran recovered first. He always recovered first. It was one of the things he was genuinely good at, pulling composure back over his face like a curtain, and resuming the voice of official neutrality. He announced, in that voice, that the verification for Mara Voss was concluded, and that she could step down from the dais. He did not announce a result. He did not say her tier. He did not say her status. He simply said concluded, as though a blank result was a result, and moved on to the name after hers with a speed that was just slightly too fast to be natural. Mara stepped down. She walked back to her place in the low row with the same even pace she had walked up with. She stood between Owen and the empty space where Penn had been before the girl was moved to her new tier position following her strong verification. Owen glanced at her sideways. She did not return the glance. She kept her eyes forward and her breathing slow and her hand pressed flat against her own thigh, because it was the only way she could stop herself from reaching back to touch her shoulder again. The warmth was still there. Dimmer now, but still there, a background heat that sat behind her shoulder blade like an ember that had not quite gone out. The ceremony continued. Names, seals, glowing marks, the ordinary business of a pack confirming itself. Mara stood through all of it and registered almost none of it, because the greater part of her attention was on the back left corner of the hall where the stranger stood and watched, and still did not move. He was tall. That was the first concrete thing she catalogued, because height was simply a fact and facts were easier to hold on to than the other things she was feeling. He was tall, and he stood with the kind of posture that did not come from military training alone. It came from a life in which people consistently arranged themselves differently when you entered a room, until your body simply learned to expect space. His sentinels flanked him without crowding him. They were aware of everything, their eyes never settling, always moving. But they gave him room, even they gave him room. He had dark hair and a face that was set into stillness with the discipline of someone who had learned, probably young, that expressions were information, and information given freely was power spent. He was watching her with exactly the kind of attention that a person gives to something they have been looking for. That was what made her skin feel strange. Not his appearance, his attention. She had spent 22 years being a person that people looked past, looked through, looked around. She had become very accustomed to that particular experience. The way you become accustomed to cold air or poor lighting. You stop noticing it because noticing it constantly would cost too much. You simply adjusted. This man was not looking past her. He was looking at her with the focused, undivided attention of someone who had crossed a significant distance to find something specific, and had just found it. Mara did not know whether to feel frightened or furious, or something else entirely, and the inability to classify what she felt was its own particular discomfort. The ceremony ended. Calder Voss gave the closing address, his voice filling the hall with the warm tones of pack unity and shared strength and the good words that leaders gave at the end of ceremonies. People began to rise, to move toward each other, to speak. The sound of the hall shifted from formal quiet into the ordinary noise of a group of people released from structure. Mara was already moving toward the side exit when she heard Calder's voice cut through the crowd. Different now, lower and sharper and stripped of the ceremony warmth. Alpha King. She stopped. She did not turn around immediately. She made herself take one more step, and then another, and then she turned. Because she was not a person who pretended not to hear things, and she was especially not a person who pretended not to hear something that important. Alpha King. The words rearranged the room. The pack members who were already standing and moving went still, heads turned. The title landed in the hall like a stone in still water, and the ripples from it spread outward immediately, changing the quality of every person's posture, every person's face. Calder Voss was walking toward the back left corner with his hand extended and his face wearing its best formal expression. Composed, welcoming, just slightly too controlled to be fully natural. The two sentinels did not move. The man at the center of all of this attention looked at Calder's extended hand and then shook it, briefly, with the efficiency of someone completing a necessary transaction. Calder, the Alpha King said. His voice was a low, even register, not soft, but not loud either. The kind of voice that carried without effort because it did not need to compete. I apologize for arriving without notice. I will explain the nature of my visit shortly. Of course, Calder said. We are honored. He said it the way practiced leaders say things they need to sound like they mean. The Alpha King's eyes moved, just once, across the hall. They landed on Mara. She was 30 feet away. There were at least 40 people between them. The hall was full of movement and noise and the complicated reshuffling of a crowd, reacting to something unexpected. He found her in under 2 seconds. And she understood, standing there with the last of the warmth still sitting behind her shoulder blade, that he had not found her by accident. He had known exactly where to look. Calder was already steering him toward the council room, filling the air between them with the pleasant sound of hospitality. The sentinels fell into step. The hall began to breathe again, voices rising as people turned to each other with the buzzing energy of a community that had just been given an enormous piece of news to process. Nina appeared at Mara's elbow from somewhere. Did you know he was coming? Mara asked. No one knew he was coming, Nina said. That's rather the point of arriving without notice. Why would the Alpha King be at an Ashvale rank ceremony? Nina was quiet for a moment. It was a specific kind of quiet, the kind that meant she had a thought she was deciding whether to share. I don't know, she said, and Mara believed her, because Nina was one of the very few people she had ever met who was genuinely bad at lying. He looked at me, Mara said. Nina looked at her sideways. I know how that sounds, Mara said. It doesn't sound wrong, Nina said carefully. I saw him. He did look at you. She paused. He also looked at the elder. The elder stepped back from me. Another silence. I noticed that as well. The hall was thinning out now, people moving to the courtyard and the dining hall, carrying their conversations with them. Mara and Nina stood in the emptying space, and the quality of their silence was different from the silence of the crowd. It was the silence of two people sitting with a question that neither of them knew how to finish forming. Go back to the infirmary, Nina said finally. Stay there. I'll find out what I can. Mara considered arguing. She looked down at her own wrist, which was unmarked and ordinary, and had been both of those things for 22 years. She pressed her right hand to the back of her left shoulder, and felt the warmth there, faint now but unmistakably present, like the memory of a fire after the fire has gone out. All right, she said. She went back to the infirmary. She did not fold bandages. She sat on the wooden stool by the window and watched the courtyard empty and fill and empty again. And she thought about the elder's face when he stepped back, and the Alpha King's eyes when they found her in the crowd, and the warmth behind her shoulder blade, and the word that was currently sitting in the back of her mind like a door she had not yet opened. The word was, finally. She did not know why that word. She did not know what it meant in this context, or where it had come from, or what she thought was finally happening. But it sat there, quiet and certain, behind everything else she was thinking. Finally. Mara Voss sat in the infirmary on a wooden stool with her hand pressed to her own back, and she waited, which was something she had always been very good at, and she let the word sit there until she was ready to understand it. She was still waiting when the knock came at the infirmary door. It was not Nina's knock. Nina knocked 3 times in quick succession with her knuckle. This was one knock, flat and deliberate, with the full of a fist. Mara stood up. She crossed to the door. She opened it. The Alpha King of the Continental Pax was standing in the narrow doorway of the Ashvale Infirmary with his 2 sentinels at a respectful distance behind him, and he was looking at her with the same expression he had worn at the back of the hall, direct, patient, and entirely unsurprised to find her here. "Mara Voss," he said, not a question, a confirmation. "Yes," she said. He looked at her for a moment, then he said, "May I come in?" It was also not a question, but he waited, and that waiting was the thing that made her step aside and let him through the door. Whatever was behind the warmth on her shoulder, whatever the elder's retreat had meant, whatever this man's presence in her pax ceremony indicated about the shape of a life she thought she had already understood, she was going to find out. She closed the door. She turned around. And the next part of her life began. He was not what she had expected from a king. This thought came to Mara in the first few seconds after she closed the infirmary door, while the Alpha King stood in the small room and looked around it with the quiet, attentive gaze of a man who was reading information from ordinary objects. He looked at the shelf of medicines. He looked at the row of clean instruments on the cloth beside the basin. He looked at the bandages she had been folding before the ceremony, still stacked, still uneven by her own private standard. And then he looked at her. She had expected more performance. In her experience, people with power performed it constantly. Calder Voss filled every room with himself. Elder Doran wrapped himself in formality like armor. Even the pack warriors, the ones with the high-tier marks glowing gold on their wrists, walked with a certain conscious projection of their own significance. This man stood in a small room with low ceilings and a cold stone floor and took up exactly the space he actually occupied, no more. He was watching her the way she watched patients, gathering information before speaking, because speaking without information was just noise. His name, she would learn in the next 2 minutes, was Calum Draven. She had heard the name before in the abstract way that people who live in small packs hear the names of people who govern larger structures, as a fact that existed somewhere in the world outside the compound walls, significant to others, irrelevant to daily life. He was the Alpha King of the Continental Pax, which meant that the Ashvale Pack, along with 37 other packs distributed across the territory, operated under his continental authority. His word was, technically, binding above even Calder Voss's. She had known all of that intellectually. Standing across from him in the infirmary, it felt different from intellectual. One of his sentinels, a woman, solidly built, with close-cropped hair and the observant stillness of someone who was always the most alert person in any given space, had remained just outside the door. The other had stayed further back, near the entrance to the compound's eastern corridor. This arrangement told Mara something. It was close protection with room to talk, not a prisoner configuration. She had treated enough injured warriors to know the difference. "Sit down," he said. Then, "Please," added not as an afterthought but as a correction, quick and clean. She did not sit down. She was in her own space, and she was not ready to be directed in her own space. "I'm fine standing," she said. He accepted this without any visible reaction. He pulled the stool from beside the window, the stool she had been sitting on 20 minutes ago, and sat on it himself, which meant she was now standing and he was seated, which inverted the power geometry in a way that she registered and found interesting. "I'm going to tell you some things," he said. "Some of them are going to be difficult to hear. I'm going to ask you to let me finish before you respond. That depends on what you say." Something moved in his expression. It was very quick, and she was not entirely sure what it was, but it was not irritation. "Fair," he said. "Then I'll try to say it well." She crossed her arms and waited. "My name is Calum Draven. You know my title. What you may not know is the reason I came to Ashvale today, which was not announced to your pack leadership in advance because prior announcement would have changed the conditions of what I needed to observe." He paused. "Specifically, I needed to observe your rank ceremony. You came for the ceremony. I came for your verification, specifically." The room felt smaller. Mara kept her face level. "Why?" "Because 3 months ago, The Continental Archive flagged an anomaly in the Ashvale Pack records. A specific record that had been altered approximately 22 years ago. He looked at her steadily. A birth record. Mara said nothing. Your birth record, he said. And a secondary record attached to it. A ceremony notation that Elder Doran filed 14 days after your birth, which was subsequently removed from the primary archive and placed in a sealed auxiliary file that only Pack leadership and the Continental Office have access to. He paused. The Continental Office accessed it 3 months ago during a routine audit. I was notified. She could hear her own heartbeat. Somewhere outside the window, a bird was calling in the pine trees, very ordinary and very far away. What was in the notation? She asked. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. Calum looked at her for a moment before he answered, and she understood that the pause was not uncertainty. He was choosing how to say the next thing with accuracy rather than softness, because softness would be a kind of dishonesty and he had already committed to saying it well. Elder Doran noted the presence of a pre-manifestation sovereign's bind on the subject, you, at the time of your birth registry. He noted its location as the left shoulder blade. He noted that the notation was to be sealed and removed from the primary record at the instruction of the Pack's then Alpha, who was your grandfather, and subsequently maintained under the same instruction by your uncle. He stopped. Are you all right? Keep going, she said. He kept going. A sovereign's bind is not common. It has not appeared in any documented Pack line in 41 years. The last recorded instance was in the Northern Territories, in a bloodline that has since merged with 3 others. The bind indicates a lineage that carries what older records call elemental sovereignty, a depth of wolf heritage that runs to the founding lines of Pack structure. It does not make the carrier dangerous. It makes them significant, in a way that certain parties find inconvenient. Mara uncrossed her arms. She crossed them again. She was not going to show him how hard her heart was beating, but she needed something to do with her hands. The Pack kept this from me, she said. Yes. For 22 years. Yes. And you knew about it for 3 months. I knew an anomalous record existed for 3 months. I did not know the full content of what it documented until I confirmed it myself today. He held her gaze. The warmth you felt on the dais during the verification, that was the bind activating in response to the seal. Elder Doran knew immediately what it meant. That was why he stepped back. Mara sat down on the edge of the examination table, not because he had asked her to sit, because her legs had decided, without consulting her, that standing was no longer the plan. She sat on the edge of the table and looked at the floor, which was stone and gray, and did not have any opinions about anything, which was currently the most appealing quality any surface in the room possessed. Say it in plain words, she said quietly. I want to hear the plain version. Calum was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You are not who they told you you were. You were never powerless. The mark that confirms that has been on you since before you could walk, and the people who were responsible for your welfare chose to hide it, because what it confirmed about you was something they found more useful to suppress than to acknowledge. The bird was still calling outside. Fold, press, stack. The bandages on the shelf were still uneven by her own private standard. The small window above them let in a thin blade of winter light that lay across the floor at an angle, and did not waver. Mara sat with all of that for a long moment. Then she said, Is the mark dangerous for me? Is there something wrong with it having been suppressed? Calum's expression shifted slightly. He had not, she thought, expected that to be her first question. No, the suppression is passive. The bind holds until the seal triggers it, or until a natural threshold of age and strength causes it to surface on its own. It would have surfaced within the next few years regardless. You are not harmed by the delay. Good, she said. That's good. You have questions, he said. I have approximately 40 questions. I'm deciding which one to ask first. Take your time. She looked up at him. He was still sitting on the stool, still with the same patient, level expression. And she thought about what it meant that the Alpha King of the Continental Packs was sitting on a wooden stool in a Pack infirmary, waiting for a low-tier aide to organize her thoughts. Why did you come yourself, she said. The Continental Office could have sent someone. They could have sent a message. They could have sent a formal inquiry to my Pack leadership. Why are you here in person? Calum looked at her. Because based on what the sealed record indicated, I was not confident that formal channels through your Pack leadership would result in you receiving accurate information. That landed cleanly. She understood exactly what it meant. You didn't trust my uncle. I didn't trust that your uncle's interests and your interests were aligned. Outside, the bird had stopped calling. The compound was quieter now, the morning ceremony fully over. People dispersed to their midday routines. Somewhere in the direction of the council room, she could hear the faint sound of voices, Calder's, she thought, and the higher register of Elder Doran's, talking quickly, talking with the energy of people managing a situation. They're going to say something to you, she said. They're going to have a version of this. They will, Calum agreed, and you've already decided what you think of it. I have a reasonable amount of information about what they're likely to say, he said carefully. I will hear them. That is not the same as being uncertain. She liked that distinction. She stored it. She looked at her own wrist, the left one, unmarked and ordinary. Then she reached back and pressed her hand flat against her shoulder blade, through the fabric of her shirt. The warmth was still there, faint but real. Her own skin, carrying a truth that had been locked away since before she was old enough to walk to the infirmary and ask Nina what the different medicines were for. I want to see the record, she said. The original notation, the sealed one. I thought you would, he said. I brought a copy. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and produced a folded document. He stood and brought it to her, and she took it from him without letting their hands touch, because she was not ready to deal with the complicated question of physical proximity on top of everything else. She unfolded it. Elder Doran's handwriting. 14 days after her birth. Precise, clear, and utterly damning in the way that facts recorded in the handwriting of the people who buried them always were. She read it twice. Then she refolded it and held it in both hands and let herself feel, for exactly the length of time it took to breathe in and breathe out 3 times, the full weight of what it said. 22 years of being told she was nothing. 22 years of lineage unclear and lowest tier, and the girl who works the infirmary because there's nothing else she's rated for. 22 years of watching the seal touch her wrist and show nothing, while the thing that actually defined her sat hidden under her shoulder blade like a kept secret that wasn't even hers to keep. 3 breaths. Then she looked up. What happens now? She said. Calum looked at her steadily. That depends significantly on what you want to happen. It was not the answer she had expected. She had expected a procedure, a continental protocol, a list of steps that she would be required to follow in a process that had already been decided for her, the way everything in her life had been decided for her, by people who found the deciding useful. She had not expected him to ask what she wanted. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, I want to talk to my uncle. Something moved behind Calum's eyes. All right. Not because I think he has a good explanation, she said. He doesn't. There is no good explanation. I want to talk to him because I want him to say it to my face. I want to hear what it sounds like when he says it out loud, in a room with me in it, rather than reading about it in a document he thought I'd never see. Calum nodded once. And after that, she said, I want to know everything, every record, every piece of documentation, everything the Continental Archive has that relates to my lineage, my mother, and what a sovereign's bind actually means for what happens next. She paused. Can you arrange that? Yes, he said, simply, without qualification. She nodded. She set the document on the examination table beside her. She straightened her spine. Then let's go talk to my uncle, she said. She walked to the infirmary door and opened it, and the winter light of the compound came in cold and bright, and Mara Voss stepped out of the room she had hidden in for 6 years, and walked toward the council chambers with her head up and the warmth at her shoulders steady as a heartbeat. Behind her, the Alpha King followed. The sentinel outside the door fell into step without being told. Whatever her uncle had been preparing to say, he was about to say it to a different version of Mara than the one he had been expecting to face, and she thought, walking across the cold stone courtyard with the pine trees ringing the compound and the winter sky wide and gray above her, that he was probably not ready for that. She was not going to give him time to get ready. She had waited long enough. The council room of the Ashvale Pack compound was designed to communicate authority. The table was long and dark, made from timber that had been in the pack for longer than anyone alive could personally remember. The chairs around it were high-backed and heavy. Portraits of former alphas lined the upper walls, all of them Voss men, going back 6 generations, all painted with the same expression of firm and benevolent dominance that portraits of pack leaders invariably wore. Mara had been in this room twice in her life. Once at the age of 9 when she had been brought in to be told, formally and briefly, that her assigned housing tier had been reduced because the infirmary aid accommodation had opened up and was considered a more appropriate placement for someone of her status. Once at the age of 16, when she had stood in front of Calder and Elder Doran and a third man whose name she had not been given, and been told that her provisional healer's training allocation had been declined and she would remain at aid level indefinitely. Both times she had sat in one of the heavy chairs and listened, and said yes when yes was required, and nothing when nothing was required. And then she had left and gone back to work. She did not sit down this time. Calder Voss stood when she came in. The motion was automatic, a reflex response to the presence of the Alpha King behind her, but the result was that he was standing when Mara entered the room, and she let that stay as it was because the standing was accurate. He should be on his feet for this conversation. Elder Doran was seated at the far end of the table. His gray robes were slightly disordered from the ceremony, one sleeve pushed up as though he had been doing something with his hands. He looked at Mara when she came in, and for the first time in 22 years of deliberate non-eye contact, he held the look. He looked at her the way people look when they have been running from something and have finally stopped running, and the thing they were running from is standing in the doorway. "Mara," Calder said. "Calder," she said. She used his name without his title because it was his name, and because he had never in her life given her a reason to use anything more formal than that, and because she was done with the customs of a structure that had been designed to keep her inside a category that was never actually hers. Calum came in behind her. His sentinel stayed outside. He moved to the side of the room, not at the head of the table, not prominently positioned, simply present in a way that made his presence impossible to ignore without trying to position himself. "I've read the sealed notation," Mara said. She did not sit. She stood in front of the long dark table and held the copy of the document in her hand. "I've spoken with the Alpha King. I understand what the notation contains." She looked at her uncle. "I want to hear your version." Calder looked at Calum before answering. Calum did not look back at him. He was looking at the portrait on the far wall with the calm expression of someone who was in no hurry and had no stake in the direction of the next thing that would be said. "Mara," Calder began, "there are things that happened before you were old enough to understand them, that required decisions to be made for your safety." "Tell me what those things were," she said. He was quiet for a moment. He was choosing. She could see him choosing. "Your mother made enemies in the years before she died. Serious enemies. People in the Eastern Territories who had significant resources and a long memory. When it became clear, when Elder Doran noted, at your birth, that you carried a mark of particular significance, it was judged that making that mark known would place you in danger, that concealing it was the safer path. Who judged that? Your grandfather. And Elder Doran. And subsequently myself when I took over pack leadership." He met her eyes. "I agreed with the decision. The decision to tell me I was powerless. The decision to keep you safe." She looked at him for a long time. She had known him her entire life. She had watched him lead the pack with genuine competence in most areas. She had watched him manage resources and navigate alliances and handle disputes with a practicality that, in her more fair-minded moments, she had been able to acknowledge was real skill. She did not think he was a cruel man. She did not think he had looked at a newborn child and made a cold calculation without feeling anything. But she also knew that feeling something and doing the right thing were not the same, and that regret after the fact did not change the fact. "Was it purely for my safety?" she said quietly. "Or did keeping the Eastern Territories unaware of my lineage also serve the alliance that Ashvale has maintained with them for the past 20 years? His jaw moved. His eyes did not drop. "Both things can be true," he said. "They can," she agreed. Which one was primary? The silence that followed was its own kind of answer. She had known it would be. She had told Calum outside the infirmary that she wanted to hear it said out loud, and she did. But she also knew that sometimes what gets said out loud is less informative than what doesn't get said, and the silence where the primary reason should have been answered was the clearest thing Calder Voss had ever communicated to her. She nodded once. "Thank you for being honest about that much," she said, and she meant it. It was a narrow honesty, incomplete and self-serving at its edges, but it was more than she had ever received from him before, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. She turned to Elder Doran. He was watching her with an expression that she had difficulty classifying. It was not quite guilt. Guilt had a particular shape, a flinching quality, a desire to look away. This was something else. Something that looked more like a man seeing something he had expected for a long time, and finding that his expectation of the shape of it was not quite accurate. "The mark," she said to him. "What does it mean? Not the political implications. The mark itself." He straightened in his chair. The elder voice came back, the formal register, the careful diction. "A sovereign's bind is a lineage indicator of the highest order. It marks a carrier as descending from one of the founding wolf lines, not just the early pack lines, but the lines that existed before formal pack structure. Lines that carried what older tradition calls source heritage. The wolf in the carrier tends to be substantial. The connection to instinct, to territory, to the deeper pack bonds runs deeper than in standard lineages. And the suppression? Passive, as the Alpha King likely explained. The mark does not activate until contacted by a verification seal, or until the carrier reaches a point of natural threshold. There is no harm to the carrier from delay. He paused. The mark cannot be destroyed. It cannot be removed. At most it can be hidden. He stopped. Then, with the particular difficulty of a man delivering the part of the truth he found most unpleasant to voice, it was always going to surface. You knew that. I knew that. And in 22 years it never occurred to you to simply tell me. He was quiet. Then, it occurred to me. Mara said nothing. The decision had been made before you were old enough to hear it, Doran said. And then enough time passed that the risk of disclosure, the risk of the Eastern Territories learning what we had been concealing, seemed to outweigh the other consideration. He stopped. He seemed to be choosing his next words with unusual care. I regret the way it was managed. You regret it, she said. Yes. That's good, she said. I want you to keep regretting it. It's the appropriate feeling for what was done. She was not cruel about it. She said it plainly, the way she said most things, because cruelty would have required energy she wasn't willing to spend. But I also want it clearly understood that this conversation, this explanation, is not absolution. I'm not giving you absolution. I'm giving you information about where we stand. She looked at both of them. I am going to work with the Alpha King's office to fully document my lineage and the Sovereign's bind. The Continental Archive will have the complete record. There will be no more sealed notations. There will be no more auxiliary files. She looked at her uncle. If the Eastern Territories have a problem with what the record shows, that is a problem for the Continental Pack Authority to manage. It is not a problem that I am going to continue to be used as the solution to. Calder looked at Calum. Calum was still looking at the portrait on the wall. He was not going to help Calder find a way out of this conversation. That was perfectly clear. All right, Calder said. His voice was quiet and a little flat, the voice of a man who had been running a particular arrangement for a long time and could feel it concluding. Thank you, Mara said. She left the council room. She walked back across the cold courtyard to the infirmary, and she sat down on the wooden stool, and she pressed her hand to her shoulder blade, and the warmth was there, steadier than it had been, as though the mark knew that something had changed, that it had been seen and named, and that the concealment was over. She sat there for a long time. Outside the window, the pine trees moved in the wind. The compound sounds continued around her, ordinary sounds, the ordinary life of the pack proceeding with the ordinary rhythm of a day that had been anything but ordinary. She thought about all of it. She thought about her mother, who had made enemies, whose name was in the sealed record in connection with hers, about whom she knew almost nothing and was now going to have to know everything. She thought about 22 years of lowest tier and lineage unclear, and the bandages on the shelf that she kept refolding because they were never quite even enough. She thought about the Alpha King, who had sat on a wooden stool and waited for her to ask the right questions, and who was currently still in the council room, she presumed, and about whom she had a great many thoughts that she was not ready to fully examine. She thought about the word that had been sitting in the back of her mind since the dais. Finally. She let herself feel it now, sitting alone in the room where she had spent 6 years being useful and invisible, and entirely more than what anyone had admitted. She let it land. Then she picked up the bandages from the shelf, because her hands needed something to do. She folded them evenly. She stacked them. She was still there when Calum came to the door an hour later, and knocked once, flat and deliberate, with the full of a fist. And this time when she opened the door, she was ready for him. 2 things happened that night that Mara did not expect. The first was that she slept, deeply and without waking, for the first time in longer than she could accurately remember. She had expected her mind to be too loud for sleep. She had expected to lie in the narrow bed in the infirmary aid quarters and run the day's events through her head in the circular and unproductive way she had run other difficult things through her head in the nights following them. She had expected the warmth at her shoulder to keep her awake with its strangeness. Instead, she fell asleep almost the moment she lay down, as though the day had settled something in her that had been unsettled for 22 years, and her body had decided it was finally safe to rest. The second thing she did not expect was the knock at her door at 6 in the morning. Not the infirmary door. Her personal door, at the end of the narrow corridor behind the main treatment room, where she had a room barely large enough for a bed, a small chest of drawers, a hook for her coat, and the collection of books she had assembled over years with the kind of careful, one-at-a-time determination that you developed when every acquisition required budgeting. No one knocked on that door. Nina occasionally knocked on the infirmary door. Owen the beekeeper had once knocked on the infirmary door to deliver a jar of honey, which was the closest he had come to a social gesture in Mara's memory. No one knocked on the personal door. She was out of bed and at the door before she was fully awake, which told her something about her current nervous system that she found slightly alarming. It was Pen. The girl stood in the corridor with her verification mark still faintly glowing at her wrist. That happened in the first 48 hours, the record said, while the mark settled. And she was holding a piece of paper folded into thirds, and she looked like she had been awake for most of the night deciding whether to come here. "What is it?" Mara said. Pen held out the paper. Mara took it and unfolded it. It was a handwritten note on pack letterhead, signed by Elder Doran. It stated that effective immediately, by authority of the pack charter provision regarding lineage clarification, Mara's tier status was under administrative review, and her current resource allocations were frozen pending resolution. Frozen. Her access to the pack supply stores, her monthly stipend, her housing status, all frozen. Pending review. She read it twice. She refolded it. "Where did you get this?" she said. "It was on the main board this morning," Pen said. "I took it down when I saw it. Other people had already read it, I think. But I took it down before more could." She was watching Mara's face with the focused attention of someone trying to gauge how bad a situation was, from the expression of the calmest person in the room. "Is it legal? Can he do that?" Mara thought about the pack charter provision that was being cited. The lineage clarification provision existed for cases where a pack member's status was found to be incorrectly recorded. It was meant, theoretically, to protect the pack from fraudulent claims. It had never, in its original drafting, been intended for a situation like this one, but it was in the charter, and Doran knew the charter the way other people knew their own names. "It's legally marginal," she said. "The provision was not written for this circumstance, but the wording is broad enough that he can make an argument for it." Pen looked at her. "What are you going to do?" Mara handed the note back to her. "Can you hold on to that for me for a few hours?" "Yes," Pen said immediately. "And don't go back to the main board." "I won't." Mara nodded. She went back into her room and dressed, and she thought about the note while she did it with the part of her mind that could think clearly even when other parts of her were doing something considerably less ordered. She thought about timing. She thought about Doran, who was a man who had sat in that council room last night and said he regretted the way things had been managed, and who had then apparently gotten up this morning and done this. She thought about the difference between what people said when they were in front of other people and what they did when they thought they were operating without an audience. She was going to need to find Calum Draven before she saw anyone else. He was staying in the East Wing guest suite, which was the nicest accommodation in the Ashvale compound, and which had been prepared for him in the 4 hours between his arrival at the ceremony and the end of the day. Mara had seen the pack staff hurrying with linens and had understood without being told what it was for. She knocked on the suite door at 10 minutes past 6 in the morning, with the particular knock he had used on her door the day before, flat and deliberate, and waited. The sentinel, the woman with close-cropped hair, opened the door. She looked at Mara without expression for 2 full seconds. Then she stepped aside. Calum was already awake and dressed, standing beside the window with a cup of something in his hand. He looked at her, and then at the window behind him, as though assessing how much of the morning she had already used to get here. "Elder Doran froze my resource allocations," she said. She did not sit down. She was not going to sit down in guest suite chairs that had been arranged for more comfortable conversations. He cited the lineage clarification provision. "It's on the main board." Or it was. Pen took it down. But the damage is done. Calum set his cup on the windowsill. "He's trying to destabilize you before you can consolidate what you learned yesterday," he said. He said it the way he said most things, plainly, without drama, because it was simply what was accurate. "That's my read," she said. "He's also trying to send a message to the pack about what kind of situation this is. If your allocations are frozen, it signals to the rest of the pack that your status is uncertain, that you're in some kind of dispute, not in some kind of rightful claim." He looked at her. "He's not stupid." "No," she agreed, "he's not. The Continental Authority supersedes the lineage clarification provision in cases where Continental Archive documentation is involved," he said. "The documentation of your sovereign's bind, once formally registered with the Continental Archive, removes any question of your status from local pack jurisdiction. It becomes a continental matter. How long does that registration take?" "In a standard process, several weeks. I can expedite to 72 hours. Mara looked at him. Doran knows that timeline. He knows that in the space between now and registration, he has room to maneuver. "Yes," Calum said. "He does. What can you do about that right now, today?" before he does anything else? He looked at her for a moment. I can invoke a Continental Provisional Hold. It's an emergency provision that freezes all local administrative actions on a member's status during an active Continental inquiry. It's used in cases of contested lineage that have continental significance. He paused. It's significant because invoking it formally declares under my authority that your case is already a Continental inquiry. That's not a reversible signal. I know, she said. Invoke it. He picked up his cup again. You're sure? I was sure last night, she said. I'm more sure this morning. The provisional hold was documented in 20 minutes. Calum's sentinel carried the papers to Elder Doran's office herself. Mara had the clear sense that the sentinel, whose name she had not yet learned, had a very specific way of delivering documents that communicated their authority without requiring any additional words. Mara waited in the corridor outside the east wing. The compound was beginning its morning movement. Pack members crossing to the kitchen, warriors heading to the training ground, children going to the teaching hall. Several people looked at her. Not all of the looks were unfriendly. Some were curious, the cautious curiosity of people who had watched something unexpected happen yesterday and were still recalibrating. A few were the particular careful blankness of people who were deciding which way the situation was going to go before they committed to a position. She knew all of those looks. She had been watching them for 22 years. Nina appeared from the direction of the kitchen with 2 cups of tea and the expression of a woman who had been up since before dawn and had opinions about what was happening and was currently restricting herself to one of them. The hold has been filed, Mara said, before Nina could speak. I know, Nina said. Word travels fast in a small compound. She handed Mara one of the cups. Are you eating anything? I'll eat later. You'll eat now, Nina said, in the voice she used for patients who were refusing treatment. I brought bread. Eat the bread, and then tell me what happens next. Mara took the bread and ate it, because Nina was right, and because she needed to eat, and because some fights were worth having, and some were just Nina being right about bread. The Alpha King's provisional hold covers me until the Continental Archive registration is complete, she said between bites. 72 hours. During that time, Doran can't take any further administrative action against my status. And after 72 hours? After 72 hours, my lineage is formally documented at the continental level, and the Sovereign's bind is on record. At that point, my status isn't a local question anymore. Nina was quiet for a moment. She drank her tea. And you? How are you? Mara looked at her. Nina was the only person in the compound who asked that question, and meant it as a real question rather than a social formality. She considered the question honestly, the way she tried to consider all honest questions. I'm angry, she said. But I'm not surprised, which makes the anger manageable. And I'm clear on what needs to happen next, which makes the anger useful rather than just loud. Good, Nina said. Clear and useful is good. I also, Mara said, and stopped. Nina waited. I also, Mara said more carefully, do not entirely know how to feel about the fact that someone I have never met before yesterday spent 3 months investigating my situation, and then came here himself to make sure I received accurate information. She looked at her cup. I don't know what to do with that. Nina's expression shifted into something that was not quite a smile. Calum Draven, she said. Yes. He has a reputation, Nina said. In the Healers Network. We hear things about the Continental Pack leadership that don't make it into regular pack channels. She paused. He is regarded as fair, uncomfortably so, in some quarters, because fair applied consistently is very inconvenient for people whose arrangements depend on the absence of it. She looked at Mara. He's also regarded as direct, as someone who says what he means and means what he says. I've noticed, Mara said. People who say what they mean are either a very good thing or a very complicated thing, depending on what they mean, Nina said. In his case, the general consensus is the former. Mara thought about the stool, the way he had sat on it and created space for her to stand. The provisional hold, filed in 20 minutes before the morning had fully begun. He's staying for the full 72 hours, she said. Nina's expression settled into something knowing that Mara decided not to examine too closely. Of course he is, Nina said. The day that followed was a full one. Calum's office sent a series of formal requests to the Pack archive, every record associated with Mara's name, her mother's name, and the sealed auxiliary file. Elder Doran complied, because the provisional hold made non-compliance a continental violation, and Doran was many things, but he was not willing to make himself a continental violation. The records came, and Calum's sentinel organized them on the large table in the East Wing suite. and Caleb and Mara spent most of the afternoon going through them together. There were more of them than she had expected: birth records, housing records, training records with notations she had never seen, because the notations had been in the version kept by pack leadership rather than the version given to her. Requests she had filed for healers' training allocation, with responses attached, responses she had received, and beside them, the reasons recorded internally for those denials, reasons that had nothing to do with her capability and everything to do with keeping her access to pack resources, and therefore pack information, limited. She read them all. Beside her, Caleb read them at the same pace and said nothing, and she was grateful for the nothing, because she did not want commentary on what she was reading. She just wanted to read it. Her mother's name was in more of the records than she expected: Claire Voss, née Sutton, age 31 when she died, born in the Western Territories, arrived at Asheville at 24 when she bonded with Mara's father, who had died 6 months before she was born, whose name was in one record and not in any other, which told its own story about how his memory had been managed. She touched the record with her fingertip, held it there. "Your mother was from the Sutton line," Caleb said quietly. "The Western Sutton line has documented connections to 3 founding families. One of them carries the Sovereign's Bind heritage. When she and your father bonded, 2 lineages converged in you that hadn't been in direct combination for," he looked at another document, "at least 130 years. Mara looked at him. "That's what made your mark so significant," he said. "Not one lineage. Both together." He paused. "And why it made certain people very eager to make sure no one noticed." She sat back. She looked at the documents spread across the table, her whole history, pulled out of its hiding places and laid flat in the afternoon light. "They were afraid of me," she said. "Yes," he said. She sat with that, not with pride, not with satisfaction, with the particular weight of a thing that changes the shape of everything you thought you knew. They had not ignored her because she was nothing. They had made her invisible because she was too much, and they had not wanted to deal with what too much meant. She looked at the table. She thought about 6 years of folding bandages. "I need air," she said. He stood without a word, and they went outside, into the compound's back courtyard where the pine trees were dark against the late afternoon sky, and the air was cold and clean, and they stood there in the silence for a while, and neither of them said anything, and neither of them needed to. The 72 hours had begun. A great deal was going to happen inside them. That evening, the pack's attitude shifted visibly. Mara noticed it in the way that people who have spent their lives reading rooms always notice things, not all at once, but in accumulation. The way 2 warriors who had never acknowledged her stopped and nodded when she crossed the training yard. The way the kitchen staff, who had always given her the smallest portions without being asked, gave her a full bowl without measuring it twice. The way a group of lower-tier pack members, people she knew mostly by ailment and the hour they typically knocked on the infirmary door, looked at her differently, not with the curiosity of the uncertain, but with something that had more weight to it. She was being reevaluated. She understood the mechanism of it. The Alpha King's presence in the provisional hold and the archive request had communicated, without a single word being said directly to the general pack population, that the girl everyone had written off as a lowest-tier aide with an unclear lineage was not, in fact, what she had been presented as. Packs were sensitive to status the way instruments were sensitive to pressure. The slightest change in the reading and the whole community recalibrated. It was strange to be the reading that was changing. She was in the infirmary after dinner, restocking the supply shelves with the methodical attention she gave to the task every week, when Cal, the young warrior who had grinned during his own verification, appeared in the doorway. He was 20, broadly built, with a face that defaulted to an open expression he had clearly never learned to close. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You're already in the doorway," she said. "Go ahead. Is it true you've been highest tier all along? Like, actually highest? Higher than Doran's documented candidates?" She set down the jar of antiseptic she had been positioning and turned to look at him. "Who told you highest tier?" "Ilan told me." Ilan heard from Kip, who works the archive corridor. "I don't know what my tier will be assessed at under the formal documentation," she said. "That assessment happens at the continental level. What I can tell you is that the mark I carry is not a low-tier mark." He thought about this. "So you've just been here, all this time, working the infirmary?" "Yes," she said. He looked at her in the slightly stunned way of someone trying to recalibrate a view of someone they thought they understood. She waited for whatever would come next. "That's a long time to keep showing up," he said. "It is," she agreed. He nodded slowly, then he said, if you need anyone to stand with you on something, I'm available for that. He said it with the earnest directness of a 20-year-old who had not yet learned to dress his impulses in more sophisticated language, and she found it more moving than she expected to. Thank you, Cal, she said. He nodded again and left, satisfied. She went back to the antiseptic. Penn came by an hour later, still carrying the note from the main board, to report that Elder Doran had not appeared in any of the common spaces since the morning and that his office curtains were drawn, which she reported with the tone of someone delivering slightly satisfying news. Nina came by to drop off a food package that contained considerably more than necessity required, which was how Nina expressed affection. Owen the beekeeper did not come by, but he sent a jar of honey by way of the girl who delivered messages for him, which was its own kind of language. The pack was making decisions. Not all of them would go her way, she was clear-eyed about that. The people with alliances in the Eastern Territories, the ones who had made their quiet side deals on the assumption that Calder's arrangement with that power block would hold, those people were unhappy, and their unhappiness had a specific quality that was about self-interest rather than her. She had already identified 3 pack council members who had spoken in low voices at the edge of the dining hall after the evening meal, and she did not need to hear the words to understand the subject. She let them talk. She would deal with whatever they decided when she had to. At 9 at night, she locked the infirmary and went back to her quarters. The document copies that Calum had allowed her to keep were on the small chest of drawers, next to her books. She looked at them for a while, standing in the doorway of her own room. The narrow bed, the hook for the coat, the books acquired one by one. This space had been her entire private world for 6 years, and she had made it enough by sheer determination, and she looked at it now with complicated feelings that she could not fully sort. She picked up the document on top. Her mother's face looked back at her from the photograph in the upper corner of the birth record. Claire Voss, née Sutton. She had Mara's jaw, the same set to the mouth, the same eyes, which Mara had always thought were her own entirely singular feature, and which were, apparently, something she had from somewhere. She sat on the bed. She held the document. She did not let herself cry, because she was not someone who found crying useful, but she sat there for a long time with the photograph and the name and the Western Sutton line and the converging lineages that had made her what she was, and she felt the warmth at her shoulder blade pulse gently, as it had been doing all day. And she thought about her mother showing up at 24 at a pack that was not hers, bonding with a man who died before his daughter was born, carrying a lineage that made enemies, and raising Mara, for 7 years, in a place that did not acknowledge what either of them were. She thought, she knew. Her mother had known what Mara carried. The sealed record had been filed 14 days after her birth, which meant Doran had seen it at the birth ceremony. Her mother had been in the room. She had known from that day, for 7 years until she died, and she had not told Mara, and she had not tried to claim the mark, and she had not made it political. She had just raised a girl who was very good at folding bandages and keeping her head up and showing up to things she did not want to attend. Mara thought, she was teaching me. She thought, she knew I was going to need all of it. Outside, the compound was quiet. The pine trees moved in the cold night air. The stars were very clear. Through the thin wall she could hear, very faintly, the distant sound of the East Wing, the Alpha King's rooms, where, she imagined, he was still working, still reading records, still building the case that she was going to walk into the Continental Assembly with in 72 hours, or however long it took. She set the document down. She lay back on the narrow bed. She thought about Calum saying, "That depends significantly on what you want to happen." She thought about what she wanted. It was a question she had not been in the habit of asking herself, because wanting required the belief that getting was possible, and for a long time getting had not been possible in any way that mattered. She had wanted healer's training and been denied. She had wanted to know who her mother was and been told the records were restricted. She had wanted, at 15, to be someone the pack acknowledged, and instead they had given her an infirmary cupboard and called it opportunity. She had learned, over years, to redirect want into doing, to want less and do more, to find the things she could actually affect and put all her energy there. It was how she had survived, and she was not sorry for it, but she was beginning to understand that it was also a limitation she had built for herself out of necessity, and that the necessity was now changing. What did she want? She pressed her hand to her shoulder blade. The mark pulsed, warm and steady. She wanted her mother's full record. She wanted the Continental Archive documentation. She wanted the Eastern Territories to know exactly who she was, and find the information ungovernable. She wanted to sit in a room with Elder Doran and watch him answer for 22 years of deliberate record-keeping without ever asking whether the person those records described had a right to see them. She wanted, she realized, to go to the Continental Assembly. Not because Calum had invited her, because it was hers to go to. She sat with that for a while. Then, because she was who she was, she got up, went to the chest of drawers, and began organizing the documents into a logical sequence for the next day's work. The 72 hours had 36 of them left. She was not going to waste them. The Eastern Territories sent their people before the 72 hours were up. Mara was in the East Wing archive room with Calum and a stack of lineage documentation when Calum's senior sentinel, the woman with close-cropped hair, whose name Mara had by now learned was Hera, came to the door and said, without expression, that a delegation of 4 had arrived from the Keld territory and were requesting an immediate meeting with the Ashvale Pack leadership. Calum looked at Mara. Mara looked at the stack of documents on the table. "How far into the registration process are we?" she said. 60%, he said. "The core lineage documentation is through. The bind notation and the historical Sutton-Voss lineage convergence confirmation are still processing." She did this calculation. They knew, she said. Someone told them the timeline. Someone told them that if they arrived before registration was complete, there was still room to argue that my status was in question. "That's my read," Calum said. "Who told them?" He was quiet for a moment. "That's a good question." She thought about it. It narrowed to 2 possibilities very quickly, and both of them were people she had already had conversations with this week. "Doran or Calder," she said. "More likely Doran," Calum said. "Calder made a choice in the council room 2 days ago that limits his options. He's not eager to be seen making that kind of contact." "Doran, then." She looked at Hera. "Who are they?" "The delegation. Do you have names?" Hera had names. She had names, rank descriptions, and a preliminary assessment of their likely objective that she delivered in the efficient, low-tone manner of someone who had delivered a great many briefings and removed everything from them that was not immediately useful. The lead delegate was a man named Arden Cole. He held a senior administrative title in the Keld territory governance structure. The other 3 were aides and, in Hera's assessment, at least one was not purely administrative, but that was a conversation for a different room. "Arden Cole," Mara said. "I've seen that name." She went to the documents on the table and moved through them until she found the one she was looking for, her mother's restricted file, the one that contained the internal communications from the period shortly before Claire Sutton-Voss had died. She turned pages until she found the reference. There, in a communication addressed to the then Alpha, Mara's grandfather, from a Keld territory representative, requesting confirmation that the Sutton-Voss bonding had not resulted in any notable lineage outcome. Signed with initials only, but the registration number beside the initials matched a format Calum had shown her, and when she held it up to him now, he looked at it, and something shifted in his expression. "That's a Keld administrative registration number," he said. "From 23 years ago." He looked at her. Arden Cole would have been young, but he was already in the administrative structure. "He knew about my mother," she said. "He knew to ask." "And your grandfather confirmed that there was no notable outcome," Calum said, which was the lie that held everything together for 22 years. She set the document down with a care she did not feel. "He's here because someone told him the lie is coming undone, and he wants to contain it before the registration is complete." "Yes. What can he actually do?" Calum looked at her steadily. "Nothing, legally, once the registration is complete. Before completion, he can file a territorial dispute with the Continental Authority, a challenge to the validity of the documentation. It's a procedural tool. It doesn't overturn anything, but it creates a delay." He paused. "A delay during which your provisional hold expires and your local status is back in play." She sat down. She looked at the table. 60%. 36 hours left at the standard pace, now reduced because the delegation had arrived and the clock had changed. "Can you expedite the remaining 40%? To get the full registration inside 12 hours would require direct intervention from the Continental Archive Office, rather than the standard processing pathway." He paused. "I can request it. The head of the Continental Archive is someone whose professional opinion I have earned over a number of years, and I believe that a direct request from me, explaining the time pressure, would result in cooperation." "Then please make that request," she said. He nodded and left the room. Mara stayed at the table. She looked at the documents. She looked at the communication with the initials and the registration number. She thought about Arden Cole, who was somewhere in this compound right now, being given the pleasant hospitality that Ashvale extended to visitors from significant territories, and who had come here with a specific purpose that had everything to do with preventing a truth from becoming officially real. She thought about her mother, who had lived with that same man's interest directed at her for years, who had bonded with Mara's father and come to Ashvale and raised a daughter and been careful and quiet and teaching, all while men like Arden Cole maintained their version of events. She picked up another document. She read. When Calum returned 20 minutes later, she had finished reading and was sitting with her hands flat on the table and her face at the neutral she had been practicing for 22 years. The archive will expedite, he said. Estimated completion is 14 hours. Good, she said. Cole is requesting to meet with me as the Continental Authority present. I know, she said. That's what I expected. I can decline. Don't decline, she said. He looked at her. Meet with him. Let him say what he came to say. Don't commit to anything, and don't give him information about the timeline. I want to know what version of events he presents. He studied her for a moment. You want to hear how they've been telling this story? I want to hear what he thinks the pressure point is, she said. If he comes with the right argument, he might find a procedural angle I haven't thought of. I need to know what he has before I can decide how to respond to it. Calum was quiet for a moment. You've thought like this for a long time, he said. It was not quite a question. When you have no formal power, she said, you learn to use every other kind. She pushed back from the table. I'll be in the back garden. Come find me when the meeting is over. The back garden of the Ashvale compound was technically a maintenance space, a strip of ground between the east wing and the outer fence where the pack kept their winter stock of preserved root vegetables and dried herbs in covered earthen stores. In the seasons when nothing was being stored, it became an outdoor space that no one much used because it was behind the building rather than in front of it. And pack social life happened in front of buildings, not behind them. Mara liked it because it was behind the building rather than in front of it. She had been coming here to think for years, and in all those years, almost no one had ever appeared to interrupt her. She stood beside the fence and looked at the pine trees beyond it. She pressed her hand to her shoulder blade. The mark pulsed steadily, warm and present, as it had been doing for 3 days now. She thought it was getting stronger. She was not sure if that was the documentation process doing something, or just the mark responding to being acknowledged, to no longer being hidden. As though something in it had been waiting for this, had been patient in the way that things that cannot be extinguished are patient, and was now doing what it had always been going to do. She thought about what she wanted from the next 14 hours. She thought about Arden Cole in the council room, managing this situation with the competence of a man who had been managing this particular situation for 23 years. She thought about what she was going to say when she finally walked into a room with him herself. She had not decided whether that was going to happen today. She was still deciding. There was a version in which she let Calum handle the meeting and stayed in the background until the registration was complete, and then stepped forward from a position of fully documented authority. That version was sensible. It was strategic. It avoided unnecessary risk in the hours before the registration closed. There was another version. In the other version, she went to the meeting herself, not as a subject of the discussion, as a participant in it. In that version, Arden Cole looked up from whatever careful arguments he had prepared and saw, across the table from the Alpha King, the person those arguments were about. That version was riskier. Cole was experienced and he would adapt quickly, and she did not know all of his tools. But she was very tired of not being in the room. Hera appeared at the garden entrance. She had a specific quality of movement that Mara had come to recognize as the movement of someone delivering time-sensitive information calmly, not running, but with purpose that was barely contained. The delegate is asking for you, Hera said. Mara turned from the fence. He's asking for me specifically? He said, and I'm quoting directly. Hera's expression did not change, that he would prefer to conduct this meeting with the full relevant party present. Mara looked at her. He knows you're here, Hera said. He has a source in this compound who told him. He's choosing to name you rather than pretend otherwise. He's showing me that he has more information than I might have assumed, Mara said. That was my read as well, Hera said. Mara straightened her coat. She had a good coat, one of the 2 good things she owned, the coat and the shirt she wore to the ceremony. She had bought the coat 3 years ago with money saved from 4 months of her stipend, and it was good quality, warm wool in a dark gray, and it fit well. She thought, you came here to manage a situation. You asked for me specifically because you thought it would give you an advantage. You think I'm going to walk in nervous and off balance and you're going to be the most prepared person in the room. She thought, you have been wrong about me for 22 years. Tell the Alpha King I'll join him in 5 minutes, she said. Hera nodded and turned. Mara looked at the pine trees for one more moment. She let herself feel the warmth at her shoulder blade, steady and certain, and hers. She thought about her mother, who had been careful and quiet in teaching. She thought, I've been taught well. She walked to the council room. When she opened the door, 4 people looked up from the table. Calum was at one end, his expression composed and unrevealing. His second sentinel stood at the wall. 3 of Cole's aides sat in varying postures of formal attentiveness. And Arden Cole, at the center of the opposite side of the table, looked at her with eyes that did a very fast and very professional assessment and then went carefully neutral. He was older than she expected, 60 perhaps, silver-haired, with the kind of face that had been good-looking in its time, and had aged into distinguished. His suit was well made, and his posture was the posture of a man who had been comfortable in formal rooms for 40 years. He looked at her. She looked at him. She pulled out the chair directly across from his and sat down. Arden Cole, she said. Mara Voss, he said. Let's hear what you came to say, she said. And the second most important conversation of her week began. Arden Cole had prepared well. She could see it in the way he opened. Not with demands, not with opposition, with concern. He was a man who had spent 4 decades learning that the most effective opening in a difficult room was the one that sounded most reasonable. He expressed concern for Mara's well-being. He expressed concern about the pace at which significant lineage revelations were being processed, and whether she had had adequate time to absorb the information she had received. He expressed concern, in particular, about the possibility of external interests moving faster than was genuinely in her best interests, and he said this with a slight directional glance toward Calum that was extremely well done for being so slight. Mara listened to all of it. She kept her face level and her hands flat on the table. When he paused, she said, "What is your specific concern?" He looked at her steadily. "My concern is that a young woman who has spent her life in a limited information environment is now being rapidly repositioned on the basis of documentation that she has not had sufficient time to independently verify, by a party who has a significant institutional interest in the outcome." "Are you suggesting the documentation is inaccurate?" she said. "I'm suggesting that independent verification is a reasonable step. The documentation is Continental Archive material," she said. "What verification process would satisfy you that it was accurate, and who would you propose conduct it?" A slight pause. He had expected her to be less direct. She could see it in the quality of the pause. "The Keld territory has its own lineage archivists," he said. "People with significant experience in historical pack documentation. People under your territorial authority," she said. Another pause. "People with professional credentials." "Let me ask you something else," she said. "In the communication sent to the then Alpha of Ashvale approximately 23 years ago, requesting confirmation of the Sutton-Voss lineage outcome, was that communication sent on your authority?" The room changed temperature, not literally, but the quality of attention in it became significantly different. Cole's hands, which had been resting easily on the table, shifted slightly. He did not look at his aides. He was good enough not to look at his aides, because looking at them would be an admission that he needed something, and he was not going to admit that. "I worked in the Keld administrative office at that time," he said. "It is possible that I was involved in routine correspondence of various kinds. The registration number on that communication matches your professional registration at that time," Mara said. "I've had that confirmed." She had not. She was guessing from what Calum had told her about the format, but guessing with confidence had a particular quality that was difficult to distinguish from knowing, and Cole was going to take a calculation before he called her on it. He took the calculation. He said nothing. "The Eastern Territories have maintained a specific arrangement with the Ashvale Pack for 22 years, she said, "an arrangement that depended on my lineage remaining undocumented. I understand the architecture of that arrangement. I understand why you're here today." She looked at him steadily. "But I want you to understand something clearly. The question of who I am is not a negotiation. It is a fact. The Continental Archive registration is processing, and when it completes, that fact will be official and permanent. What you do with your territorial arrangements in response to that fact is your concern, not mine." Cole looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Calum. Calum was looking at the table with the expression of a man who was examining the wood grain with genuine interest, and had nothing whatsoever to add to the conversation. Cole looked back at Mara. "You are very certain for someone who learned all of this 4 days ago," he said. "I am certain," she agreed, "because the facts are certain. My certainty is proportional to the evidence, not to how long I've had to sit with it." She paused. "How long have you known this day was coming?" He was quiet. "You sent that communication 23 years ago," she said. You knew what you were asking them to conceal. You have been maintaining that concealment indirectly for 22 years. She held his gaze. In some way you have been thinking about this day longer than I have been alive. Something moved in his face. It was very brief. She was not sure what it was. Not guilt exactly. Not quite that. Something more complicated. The expression of a man who had made a decision decades ago that he had framed to himself as necessary and had lived with that framing, and who was now sitting across from the consequence of that decision and finding that the consequence was considerably more present than a framing. The Keld territory will review its relationships with all relevant parties, he said. He had found his formal voice again. Smooth, distancing, the language of someone creating official record. We will, of course, cooperate fully with the Continental Archive process. I'm glad to hear it, she said. He stood, his aide stood. He looked at her one more time, and this time the look was different. It had the quality of a man storing something. She held the look and let him store whatever he was going to store. He left. The council room was quiet for a moment. Then Calum said, without looking up from the table, "The registration number." "You're right that I guessed," she said. "But he didn't call it." "No," Calum said. "He didn't." He looked up. "He's going to adjust his position. He's not done. He'll file something with the Continental Authority, a procedural challenge, before the end of the week. But it will be defensive rather than offensive." The shape of the meeting changed. "Yes," she said. "How did you know it would change if you said that?" She thought about it. "Because the only people who don't flinch when you name what they did are the ones who have already decided they don't care." He came here trying to project concern and reasonableness. That's the behavior of someone who still cares about the optics of their position. She straightened the papers in front of her that she hadn't actually been using. He couldn't both maintain that optic and not respond to being named directly. The two things were incompatible. Calum looked at her. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Not nothing," his expression said. But he did not say what the something was, and she did not ask him. The rest of the day was administrative. More documents, more requests. A call from the Continental Archive office confirming the expedited timeline. Nina appeared at the East Wing door around 6 in the evening with another food delivery, looked at the table covered in documents, looked at Mara, looked at Calum, and left without comment in the manner of a woman who had formed a view and was keeping it entirely to herself. At 9, Hera confirmed that Cole's delegation had accepted the PAC's overnight accommodation and would depart in the morning, which meant he had decided not to escalate further in person. This was the right read, and Mara had expected it. But she still felt the small specific easing of attention that had been present since his name had first been mentioned. She walked to her quarters through the cold compound night. The stars were out again. The pine trees were still and dark. The mark at her shoulder was warm and steady, and she pressed her hand to it briefly as she walked, and felt it pulse against her palm and thought, 12 more hours. When she got to her room, there was a book on the chest of drawers that had not been there in the morning. She picked it up. It was old. Older than anything in her collection, with a worn cloth spine and pages that had gone soft at the corners from use. She opened it. A handwritten note on a plain piece of paper was tucked inside the front cover. The handwriting was clear and even, and not elaborate. It said, "The Sutton line documented. Original edition." That was all. She looked at the book. It was a historical record, handwritten, dense with entries, beginning with names and dates and lineage connections that went back further than any official record she had ever seen. She turned to the index at the back and found the Sutton name. The entry was long. She sat on the bed with the coat still on and read it, and the warmth at her shoulder was constant, and her mother's jaw was in the mirror, and the night was cold and the marks in the book were old, and the truth was large, and she read every word of it. When she finished, she set the book carefully on the chest. She looked at it for a moment. Then she said, to the room that was empty except for her, quietly and without drama, "There you are." She meant it for her mother, and for the lineage, and for the mark, and for herself. She meant it for all of them. The Continental Archive registration completed at 7:14 in the morning, 2 hours ahead of the expedited estimate. Mara knew the moment it happened because Hera knocked on her door at 7:15 with the formality of someone delivering official news rather than incidental information, and handed her a sealed document with the Continental Archive stamp in dark red on the outer fold, and said, "Confirmed." Mara held the document. She did not open it immediately. She stood in her doorway with her coat still on from the night before. She had not slept much, and looked at the sealed stamp on the outer fold, and felt the warmth at her shoulder blade do something that she could only describe as settling, like a river reaching the level it was always going to reach, like something that had been held slightly out of position finally moving to where it was supposed to be. She opened the document. It was 4 pages. She read all 4 pages standing in the doorway because she could not make herself wait long enough to go inside and sit down. The language was formal and specific and completely unambiguous. The Sovereign's bind documented at left shoulder blade confirmed. Sutton-Voss lineage convergence confirmed. Continental status. The word was sovereign tier. And it was the first time in her life that any official document had put a tier to her name that was not the last line of a list. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it in the inner pocket of her coat. She looked at Hera. Where is he? The East Wing garden, Hera said. He walks early. She found him standing in the space between the east wing and the outer fence, looking at the pine trees the way she had looked at them the day before. He was wearing a dark coat and had his hands in his pockets and was not doing anything in particular, which looked different on him than it did on most people. On most people, doing nothing in particular was what their body defaulted to when nothing demanded it. On him it looked like a decision, like a man who was capable of constant motion and had decided, for this particular moment, not to be. He heard her coming. He turned before she was close enough for most people to hear. It came through, she said. I know, he said. He looked at her. Hera notified me at 7:15. I assumed she notified you first. She did. Mara stopped a few feet away and looked at the trees. The morning light was coming through them in long, thin strips. Cold light, clear. The pine smell was stronger in the morning. She had always liked that. I also received confirmation, Calum said, that Arden Cole filed a procedural query with the Continental Authority this morning, before he departed. I expected that. I expected that. So did I. It's within his rights. It will result in a review process that is unlikely to produce any outcome that affects your documented status, because the documentation is complete and accurate, and the basis for the query is interest rather than evidence. He looked at her. I want you to know that my office will respond to the query. You don't need to manage that process yourself. She looked at him. Can I ask you something? Yes. The book, she said. The Sutton history. You left it on my chest of drawers. He was quiet for a moment. I thought you would want it last night rather than tomorrow morning. How did you have it? The Continental Archive has an original copy in the Historical Lineage collection. I requested it copied and delivered. He paused. I perhaps should have asked first. No, she said. I'm not objecting. I'm glad you left it. I just wanted to know. She was quiet for a moment. I read it all the way through. My mother's line goes back a very long way. Yes, he said. There's a woman in the early records, 9 generations back. Sutton, first name Lyra. She left her original pack under contentious circumstances and established a new lineage path in the Western Territories. The record says she left because the pack she was in had decided that her lineage was more useful as a political tool than as a personal heritage. She looked at the pine trees. I felt like I was reading the same story from a different century. Calum was quiet for a moment. That pattern is not uncommon in lineages that carry significant heritage. The significance makes the carrier valuable. Value, without accountability, tends to produce people who treat valuable things as resources. I know, she said. I've been a resource for 22 years. Yes, he said. You have. He said it plainly, because he was a person who said things plainly, and she appreciated that about him, the way you appreciate something that is genuinely rare. They stood in the cold garden for a while. The compound was beginning to wake around them. She could hear the kitchen sounds, the early voices. The morning light was strengthening, the strips of it through the trees widening and brightening. I need to talk to Calder, she said. Do you want me there? She thought about it. She thought about what she needed from that conversation, which was different from what she had needed 2 days ago. 2 days ago she had needed him to say it out loud. She had needed to hear the words in a room with her in it. She had gotten that. What she needed now was different. No, she said, this one should be just us. Calum nodded. Calder was in the PAC's main office, which was a room she had been in once in 22 years, for the housing allocation meeting when she was 9. He was behind the large desk when she came in, and he stood, automatically, the way he had stood 2 days ago, reflex, not intention. Sit down, she said, because she was not performing authority over him. She just needed him to be still for this conversation. He sat. She pulled a chair from the side of the room and placed it across from his desk and sat in it. She put the sealed archive document on the desk between them. He looked at it. He looked at the stamp. He did not pick it up. Registration is complete, she said. He nodded. I want to tell you what this changes, she said, and what it doesn't. He looked at her. His face had the expression she had first seen in the council room 2 days ago, the expression of a man who had been running a particular arrangement and could feel it concluding. It was not a comfortable expression. She did not try to make it comfortable. "It doesn't change that you're my uncle," she said. "By blood, that's a fact that exists regardless of what has been done with it." She paused. "It also doesn't change that you have led this pack for 15 years, and that your leadership has had genuine value to the people in it, including the people I have spent 6 years treating in the infirmary. I'm not going to pretend those things aren't real." He was watching her carefully. "What it changes," she said, "is the arrangement that has existed between Ashvale and the Keld territory, which has been built on the premise of my suppression. That arrangement cannot continue. Cole knows the documentation is complete. He filed his procedural query this morning, but it will not produce results, and eventually he will have to adjust his position in relation to the full truth of what my lineage means." She looked at her uncle. "When that adjustment happens, it will create a gap in the alliance structure that you will need to manage. I am not going to manage it for you, but I am also not going to interfere with you managing it, as long as the management does not involve any further suppression of any part of my history." Calder was quiet for a moment. "What do you want from me?" It was the right question. She had been waiting for him to find it. "I want my mother's full record," she said. "Everything that was sealed. I want it unsealed and accessible to me and to the Continental Authority. I want a formal pack acknowledgement of my lineage, placed in the primary archive where it belongs, signed by you and by Elder Doran." She paused. "And I want you to tell the Pack Council the truth. Not my version of it. I don't need a version. I need the facts stated plainly, so that the people who have been living under a structure that was built on a lie have the opportunity to understand what the structure actually looked like." He absorbed this. She could see him absorbing it. "That last one," he said quietly, "telling the council, is not optional," she said. "Not for me." He looked at the archive document. "All right," he said. The words were small, 2 words, quietly said, but they held the weight of everything they were agreeing to carry, and she registered that, and she let it sit without filling the silence with more words, because the silence was part of what mattered. She stood. "The Alpha King will be leaving tomorrow," she said. "I'll be going with him." Calder looked up. "I've been invited to the Continental Assembly," she said. "I intend to accept." He was quiet for a moment. Something moved in his face. "You're sure?" "I've been sure since the day I read the sealed notation," she said. "I'm just now in a position to act on it." She picked up the archive document from his desk. She put it back in her pocket. She looked at her uncle one more time, really looked, with the eyes of someone who had been in complicated relationship with a person for her entire life, and was now seeing them with a clarity that came from having all the information she had previously been denied. He looked older than he had 3 days ago. She thought, good. He should feel the weight of it. That is appropriate. She thought also, he is going to manage this adequately. Not perfectly, but adequately. Because he is, in his limited and compromised way, someone who genuinely cares about the pack he leads, and that will make him do the work of managing the change even when he would prefer not to. She walked to the door. "Mara," he said. She stopped. She did not turn around. "I should have." He stopped. She waited. He didn't finish the sentence. She had not expected him to. The sentence that began, "I should have had no ending," that was sufficient, and somewhere beneath his practiced composure, he knew that. "Yes," she said. "You should have." She left. She walked back through the compound in the morning light, past the infirmary where she had spent 6 years, past the kitchen where Nina was already working, past the low-tier quarters where she had lived in the smallest room for all that time. She walked through all of it with the sealed document in her pocket and the mark warm at her shoulder and the morning cold against her face. She was going to pack her things. She did not have many things. She had always known, somewhere below the level of active thought, that this fact would one day be an advantage. She was right. The afternoon before she was due to leave, the pack came to her. Not all of them. Not Doran, who remained behind his curtained office. Not the 3 council members whose quiet evening conversation she had noted with interest. Not all of the pack members who had recalibrated their view of her with the careful neutrality of people whose recalibration was contingent on which way things settled. But enough of them. It started with Cal, who appeared at the infirmary door while she was doing her final stock check, and asked if he could help carry anything, which was a practical question with an underlying quality that went beyond practicality. She gave him a box of reference books to carry to the East Wing, because the books were genuinely heavy, and because giving him a task made the interaction manageable rather than awkward. Then Penn, who arrived with a small wrapped item, and handed it to Mara with the look of someone who had deliberated over a gift and was worried it was wrong. Inside the wrapping was a small carved figure, a wolf, simple and well-made, from the craft workshop where Pen's mother worked. "So you have something from here," Pen said. Mara held it and thought of words that were adequate to that, and found that there were not adequate words, so she just said thank you, and meant it with everything she had. Then Owen the beekeeper, who appeared without warning in the infirmary doorway at 3 in the afternoon and stood there for a moment in silence, and then set a small wax-sealed jar on the counter, and then left, and that was that. Then 4 other people, in ones and twos, with small gestures of acknowledgement that ranged from a handshake to a quietly offered piece of information about their own pack history that they thought she should know before she left. Each of them was different. All of them were, in their way, the same thing. The pack recognizing something in her that the pack had been told not to recognize for 22 years, and now recognizing it. She stood in the infirmary, which smelled of pine and antiseptic, and the particular blend of those two things that she had inhaled so many times it had become indistinguishable from the smell of her own memory, and she felt the accumulation of all of it land. Nina came in at 4 and found her sitting on the stool by the window. "How are you?" Nina said. "Strange," Mara said honestly. "I feel strange." Nina sat in the patient's chair, the old wooden chair with the cushion that had been replaced twice since Mara started working here, and looked at her. "You're leaving tomorrow," she said. "Yes. And you feel strange about it." "I expected to feel." Mara stopped. "I expected to feel clear. I've been working toward this kind of clarity for long enough that I thought when it came, it would be simple, clean." She looked at the window. "It's not simple. Clarity about what you should do doesn't mean simplicity about how it feels," Nina said. "No," Mara said. "I'm learning that." Nina was quiet for a moment. "You're going to be all right," she said. She said it the way she said the useful, accurate things that the situation actually called for, not as comfort, as information. "I know," Mara said. "I would also," Nina said, choosing her words with the careful but not unkind delivery she reserved for important subjects, "like you to think about the fact that not everything you're feeling strange about is about the lineage documentation and the archive registration." Mara looked at her. Nina's expression was composed and entirely knowing. "I'm not thinking about that," Mara said. "All right," Nina said, in the tone of someone who is very comfortable allowing other people to believe things that are not quite accurate, because they will figure it out in their own time. Mara looked back at the window. Outside, the light was going golden and late, the way it did in the late afternoon in the compound when the pine trees caught it. She had watched this light from this window a great many times. She thought about Calum in the garden that morning, the dark coat, his hands in his pockets, the way he had stood with his back to her and still known exactly when she was close enough to hear him turn. She thought about the stool, the first day, and the way he had sat on it and made her standing into something other than what it would have been if he had stood over her. She thought about the book on the chest of drawers. She thought about this morning in the garden, the way he had said yes, you have, plainly, without softening it, because he was a person who said things plainly and did not consider truth to require apology. She pressed her hand to her shoulder blade. The mark pulsed. "I'm going to finish my stock check," she said. "Of course you are," Nina said, with the expression that was not quite a smile. The evening was clear and cold. The compound was quieter than usual, not because anything dramatic was happening, but because the week's events had given the pack a great deal to absorb, and communities absorbing significant things tended to quiet down while the absorption happened. Mara ate dinner in the kitchen with Nina and Pen and Cal and Owen, who appeared at the kitchen table without announcement and sat at the end of it with his jar of honey and a piece of bread, and did not say much, which was how he always was, and which was therefore exactly right. After dinner, she walked the compound. She did it slowly and deliberately, because she was going to leave tomorrow, and she wanted to take it in with intention rather than just have it disappear behind her. The training yard. The main hall, dark now, its heavy door closed. The archive room where she had broken in with a hairpin at 15. The courtyard where she had stood for 6 rank ceremonies and come down off the dais every time with her chin level and her face neutral. She stood in the courtyard for a while. She thought about the girl she had been at 16, standing in this same space after being told the healer's training was denied. She remembered the particular quality of that day, the way the light was, the sound of the pack around her, going about its ordinary business while hers had just been reduced again. She remembered deciding to go back to the infirmary and learn wound irrigation because it was something she could learn. She did not feel sorry for that girl. That girl had known something important, that what you could not take by right, you could build by work, and that work was its own kind of dignity. She felt something more complicated than sorry. She felt grateful, not to the people who had made things hard, to the girl herself, who had kept going. She heard footsteps behind her. She knew before she turned. Calum was walking across the courtyard toward her at an unhurried pace. He stopped beside her and looked at what she was looking at, which was the dais. "You've walked the compound," he said. "Yes. Hera said you'd be doing that." She looked at him sideways. Hera said, "She's observant." "She's excellent," Mara said. "She is," he agreed. They stood looking at the dais, the stone dais where she had stood 4 days ago, with her hand pressed to her own shoulder blade, and the pack watching, and the elder stepping back. "I'm going to remember this exactly as it is," she said. "I don't want to soften it later. I want to keep the actual shape of it." Why? She thought about Lyra Sutton, 9 generations back, leaving her pack under contentious circumstances and building something new. She thought about her mother, 24 years old at the gate of this compound, carrying a heritage she knew was going to make things hard. She thought about what it meant to carry something significant in a world that preferred you didn't. "Because it's useful," she said. "The real shape of things is always useful." Calum turned to look at her. In the low evening light, his face was very still. "Tomorrow," he said. "We leave at first light." "I'll be ready," she said. He nodded. He started to turn. "Calum," she said. He stopped. She looked at him directly. "The book," she said. "The Sutton history. Thank you. Specifically and sincerely." He held her look for a moment. "You should have had it years ago," he said. "I know," she said, "but I have it now." He nodded again, and he walked back across the courtyard in the direction of the east wing, and she watched him go with a complicated internal situation she was not currently managing, and then she looked back at the dais. She stood there until the cold got serious about itself. Then she went back to her room and finished packing the small bag she was taking with her. Books on top, the carved wolf from Penn, wrapped carefully, the wax-sealed honey from Owen, tucked against the book so it wouldn't shift, the Sutton history, in her coat pocket, the archive document, in her coat's inner pocket. She was ready. The road from Ashvale to the Continental Assembly seat took 3 days. On the first day, Mara learned the rhythms of travel with people who did it constantly. Calum's vehicle was large and practical, built for territory roads rather than comfort, with enough room in the back for documents and equipment, and 2 passengers who were not yet sure how to be in the same space for extended periods without the structure of a task. The first task presented itself before they had been on the road an hour. Calum pulled out a flat portfolio of documents from the side compartment and spread them on the fold-down surface between the seats and said, "The Continental Assembly. What do you know about it?" She told him what she knew, which was the general outline: 38 packs, Continental Authority, annual sessions, matters of interpack governance and resource agreements. The overview that someone who lived in a low-tier corner of a mid-sized pack gathered from oblique references over a lifetime. He listened to all of it and then said, "That's accurate as far as it goes." Then he began filling in everything beyond that, and they spent the next 4 hours going through the assembly structure in a conversation that was not a lecture but a mutual examination. He would explain a structural element, and she would ask questions, and those questions would sometimes redirect where they went next because her questions were good questions, and she could tell from the quality of his answers that he was finding them good. By the end of the first day, she had a working understanding of the assembly's formal structure that was more detailed than what most pack members had, and a developing sense of the informal structures that operated underneath the formal ones, the alliances, the historical tensions, the specific individuals whose positions and interests shaped what the formal processes actually produced. Hera drove. The second sentinel, whose name Mara had now learned was Ivan, was in the front passenger seat and handled communications when they came in. They were efficient and unobtrusive, and treated Mara with the same professional courtesy they extended to everything, which she appreciated, because it did not make her feel like she needed to perform a status she was still adjusting to. On the evening of the first day, they stopped at a territory way station, a pack facility on the Continental Road network that provided accommodation for official travelers. It was more comfortable than anything Mara had lived in for the past 6 years. She did not make a point of this. She unpacked her bag with the same methodical attention she brought to everything, arranged her books on the shelf, and went to bed. She slept well again. She was beginning to think that sleeping well was what happened when the thing you had been braced against was finally moving rather than just sitting heavily on you. On the second day, they covered different ground. She was looking out at the pine forest when Calum said, "Tell me about the infirmary." She turned from the window. The Ashvale Infirmary? You've worked there for 6 years. You were trained by the pack healer. Your file, the full file, not the sanitized version, shows a level of medical competence that would qualify you for formal healer certification under the Continental standards. She looked at him. I know. Do you want that certification? She considered it. I want to know what my options are before I decide what I want, she said. I've been working in a single context for a very long time. I don't think I should make major decisions about what I want before I've seen more of the landscape. He nodded. That's reasonable. Why did you ask about the infirmary? He was quiet for a moment. Because I've been reading your file for 3 months, he said. The complete file. And the most consistent thing in it, the thing that appears regardless of what was happening around it, was your presence in that room. The work you did there. The choices you made about what to learn and how to apply it. He looked at her. That's information about who you are. She held his gaze. You've been thinking about who I am for 3 months. I've been thinking about your situation for 3 months, he said carefully. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back out the window. The pine forest had given way to open terrain, winter-brown grassland rolling out on either side of the road, and the sky above it was very wide and very pale. She had never been this far from Ashvale. She had never been further from Ashvale than the nearest town, which was a 2-hour walk and offered a general store and a small market on Thursdays. This was different. She let herself feel that. The size of the sky, the distance the road stretched, the fact that she was on it. I thought, she said after a while, that when I found out what the mark meant and who I was and what had been hidden, I thought that would be the thing, the central thing, and it is. But it's also not the only thing. He waited. I've been thinking about the infirmary, she said, not as a limitation anymore, as something I chose. Every day for 6 years, I chose to go back to that room and be useful in it. And I wasn't making the best of a bad situation. Or not only that, I actually cared about it. I cared about the work, about the people I was treating. She paused. I don't want to give that up because it was associated with a period of my life that was defined by being suppressed. The suppression was wrong. The work wasn't. He was quiet for a moment. That distinction is important, he said. I thought so. The Continental Assembly has a medical oversight function, he said. It's an under-resourced area. The people who do it are competent in the administrative sense, but their practical experience is limited. If someone with genuine clinical experience were involved in that function, he stopped. She looked at him. You're not suggesting things, she said. I'm not suggesting anything, he agreed. I'm describing a landscape. You said you weren't going to do that. I said I wasn't going to tell you what to want, he said. Describing a landscape is different. She almost smiled. She stopped it before it got anywhere. All right, she said. Tell me about the medical oversight function. He told her, and she listened, and asked questions, and the landscape rolled past outside the window, and the distance from Ashvale grew larger, and the weight of its smallness grew correspondingly lighter, and she thought, this is what it feels like. Not arrival. Not yet, but movement, the specific feeling of moving towards something rather than being held in place. She could feel it in her whole body. The mark at her shoulder pulsed, warm and regular, like a compass that had finally been held the right way up and was pointing. On the 3rd day, in the early afternoon, they reached the Continental Assembly seat. She had read descriptions of it. She had seen a drawing of it in one of the historical records she'd gone through in the East Wing with Calum. The drawing had given her a general impression of a significant building in a significant location. The building was larger than the drawing suggested. It sat at the crest of a long approach road, stone-built and very old, with wings extending on both sides in a layout that communicated, without trying to, the breadth of what happened inside it. Not ornate. The stone was plain and heavy, and the windows were large and practical. It looked like a place where serious work was done. She sat forward in the vehicle seat and looked at it. The assembly itself is in session next week, Calum said. This week is preparatory. Staff, specialists, the advisors who come ahead. It won't be at full population. Who's here now? My staff. The archive team. Several territorial representatives who arrived early. He paused. And the Senior Assembly Council. She understood the significance of that last item. The Senior Assembly Council was the body that held ongoing continental authority between full assembly sessions. Calum's authority as Alpha King interfaced with theirs on matters of significant continental interest. A newly documented sovereign's bind lineage was a matter of significant continental interest. They know I'm coming, she said. They know we're coming, he said. The distinction was noted. The vehicle came up the approach road and stopped at the wide stone entrance. Hera and Ivan moved efficiently. The entrance staff appeared. Professional, unhurried, the movement of an institution that received significant visitors and had learned not to perform the receiving. Mara got out of the vehicle. She stood in front of the Continental Assembly building with her coat on and her bag in her hand, and the Sutton history in her pocket, and the archive document against her ribs, and the mark warm at her shoulder blade. She looked at the building. The building did not look back at her. Buildings did not do that. But it was very present. The way things built to last a very long time were present. Solidly, without apology. She thought about Lyra Sutton, 9 generations back, establishing a lineage in the Western Territories after leaving a pack that would not acknowledge what she was. She thought about her mother at 24, arriving at a compound that was not hers, carrying something significant and being careful with it. She thought about herself at 15 in the archive room with a hairpin. "Ready?" Calum said beside her. She picked up her bag. "Yes," she said. She walked through the entrance. The building received her the way buildings received everyone, neutrally, without judgment. But the staff moved aside and there was space where space should be, and someone whose title she did not yet know came forward to welcome the Alpha King and was clearly recalibrating in real time at the person beside him. Mara noted the recalibration. She let it happen. She was going to give people time to adjust. It was a reasonable thing to do. They had had one version of the information for a long time, and the new information was significant, and adjustment took time. But she was going to be very much here while they adjusted. That part was non-negotiable. The rooms she was given were in the eastern residential wing of the assembly complex, on the 2nd level, with windows that looked out over the courtyard and beyond it to the wide-open territory that the assembly sat within. They were good rooms, not extravagant, but clearly not low-tier rooms. Someone had made a decision about their allocation. She unpacked with the same methodical focus she brought to everything. Books on the shelf, the carved wolf from Penn on the small table beside the bed, the honey from Owen in the food cupboard, where it would keep, the archive document in the desk drawer that locked, the Sutton history on the desk itself, where she could see it. There was a knock at her door at 4 in the afternoon. She opened it to a woman of about 45 with gray-streaked hair and the brisk competence of someone who managed significant logistics and was not in the habit of being slow about it. "My name is Celine," the woman said. "I coordinate the Alpha King's schedule and the assembly support functions. I've been asked to help you get oriented." "Thank you," Mara said. Celine gave her the orientation with efficiency and without condescension, which Mara appreciated. The building layout, meal times and locations, the schedule for the week. Introduced her to 3 staff members whose names she committed to memory immediately. Because names were important and forgetting them was a choice she was not going to make. Showed her the library. A large room on the ground floor with more books than Mara had seen in one place in her life, and did not comment on the expression that crossed Mara's face when she saw it. Celine was good at not commenting on things. "The Senior Assembly Council will meet informally tomorrow morning," Celine said, at the end. "Alpha King Draven has requested that you be included." "As a subject of the meeting?" Mara said. "As a participant," Celine said, with the particular inflection of someone who had been given specific instructions about exactly that word. Mara looked at her. That was his instruction? Participant? Specifically? Those were his words, yes. She nodded. She went back to her rooms after Celine left and stood at the window and looked at the courtyard and thought about that. Participant, specifically, not subject, not case, not the matter before the council. She thought about the stool again. The first day. The deliberate inversion of the spatial hierarchy. She thought about the book. The description of the landscape on the 2nd day in the vehicle. The way he described things without suggesting them, because he understood the difference. She pressed her hand to her shoulder. She went to dinner. The dining room of the Continental Assembly Complex was designed for communal eating on a significant scale, with long tables and high windows and the same plain stone as the rest of the building. At this pre-session period, it held about 30 people, staff, specialists, the early representatives. They were a professional community, courteous to each other with the courtesy of people who worked together regularly and had long since moved past the performance of it. They looked at Mara when she came in. Not with hostility, with assessment, in the way that communities of professionals look at someone new, taking in information, calibrating, revising their expectation of who this person might turn out to be. She had been looked at that way in the compound after the ceremony. She had a sense of how to receive it. She found a place at one of the middle tables. A man about her own age, slight, with the ink-stained fingers of someone who worked with physical documents rather than digital records, glanced up and nodded. She nodded back. He went back to his dinner without making it a production, which was a good quality. His name, she learned from the name board above the serving station, was Eli Ward. He worked in the historical lineage documentation section of the archive. She thought, that is going to be a useful person to know. She ate her dinner, and listened to the room, and learned it the way she always learned rooms, quietly, with full attention, cataloging without seeming to catalog. By the time she left, she had a reasonable preliminary understanding of at least 15 people's approximate roles and interpersonal dynamics, which was not a small amount of information for one dinner. Calum was not at dinner. She noticed this the way she noticed his absence from any space she was in, which was something she was trying not to examine too closely. She went back to her rooms. She sat at the desk and opened the Sutton history. She read until the light changed outside, and the courtyard went dark and the evening stars came out above the wall, and then she put the book down and thought about tomorrow. The Senior Assembly Council. She had been doing her whole life the equivalent of sitting in the back row of the ceremony, and now she was being asked to sit at a table with the people who ran the structure that the ceremony was part of, not as the subject of their agenda, as someone who was going to participate in the conversation. She was clear about what that required. It required exactly what everything had always required: showing up, being prepared, and saying the accurate thing in the accurate way without performing anything. It required exactly what her mother had taught her. She went to bed. She slept. In the morning, before the council meeting, she went to the library. She had 40 minutes before the meeting started, and she used them the way she used every available period before something significant. She gathered information. The library had a section on continental governance history. She stood in front of it for a moment, reading spines, then pulled 4 volumes and sat at the reading table and covered as much ground as 40 minutes allowed. It was not enough to be fully prepared. It was enough to be better prepared than no preparation at all, which was the standard she had always applied. You used the time you had. You did not wish for more time while the time you had was passing. Eli Ward appeared at the library door at 35 minutes past her arrival. He stopped when he saw her. "You're the—" He stopped himself, recalibrated. "Mara Voss." "Yes," she said. "The lineage documentation section processed your archive registration," he said. "My team." "That was very fast work," she said. She meant it. "We understood it was time-sensitive," he said. He was looking at the books she had open on the table with the expression of someone recognizing a familiar activity. "Do you need anything specific?" "For the context on council structure." She looked at him. "What are the 3 things the senior council cares about most, in terms of what they're going to make of an unexpected lineage documentation in the current period?" He blinked once, then he sat down at the table, uninvited, but also entirely correctly, because the question warranted the effort of a proper answer, and said, "The Eastern territorial relationships first. The Keld procedural query will be on their minds. Second, the question of what sovereign-tier documentation means for the formal power structure of the Assembly. There are precedents but not recent ones. Third, and this is less official but more real, they're going to be looking at who you are." He looked at her steadily. "Not who the documentation says you are. Who you turn out to be." "That's useful," she said. "The documentation is the opening," he said. "The person is the argument." She nodded. She closed the books and returned them to their places. She looked at Eli Ward, who had shown up uninvited, and been entirely correct to do so. "Will you be at the meeting?" she said. "I'll have notes in the room," he said. "I support the archival function for the council." "Good," she said. She walked to the council chamber. She was 3 minutes early. She was always 3 minutes early, because the people who were perfectly on time were demonstrating adequacy, and 3 minutes early was the smallest possible signal of something more than adequacy, without being the behavior of someone who needed to impress. The chamber had a round table, which she had not expected. She stood and looked at it for a moment. Round meant no head. Round meant everyone at the table was, geometrically, in the same position. It was either a sincere arrangement or a very sophisticated signal, and she suspected it was both. She found a seat. She sat down. She put her hands flat on the table. She waited for the room to fill, and it did, and then Calum came in last, as the final person to arrive, and he looked at the table and found her, and held the look for 1 second, and she held it back, and then the meeting began. She was a participant, and she was ready for it. The Senior Assembly Council had 6 members. 3 of them Mara had read about in the governance history texts she had gone through in the library that morning. The other 3 she identified from the combination of Eli's notes earlier and what she observed in the first 5 minutes of the meeting: body language, conversational rhythm, the way each of them related to the others and to the space. The council's convener was a woman named Riva Aldis, 60, deliberate in her speech, with the specific quality of attention that belonged to someone who had been listening to difficult conversations in formal rooms for decades and had developed genuine skill at hearing what was behind the words. She opened the meeting without ceremony, stated the agenda items plainly, and managed the first few exchanges with a light hand that was nonetheless a hand. The item directly concerning Mara's documentation was third on the agenda. When they reached it, Riva Aldis said, "The Continental Archive has completed registration of a Sovereign's Bind lineage documentation for Mara Voss of the Ashvale Pack. The registration is valid and fully processed." She looked at Mara. "We're glad you're here today." "Thank you," Mara said. A man named Gregor Fenn, 70s, with the careful deliberateness of someone who had learned to speak with precision because he had been in rooms where imprecision had consequences, said, "I'd like to understand the timeline. The notation was sealed 22 years ago. What triggered the current discovery?" Calum answered this. He explained the audit process, the flagged anomaly, the 3 months of investigation. He explained it clearly and completely, with the particular quality that he brought to explanations. No unnecessary detail, no missing detail, exactly the information the question required. Gregor listened. Then he said, "Tamara, how are you finding the adjustment?" It was a personal question. She had not expected a personal question this early. She thought for a moment. "I am adjusting to a change in the factual information available to me," she said. "The adjustment to the facts themselves is ongoing. The adjustment to what the facts mean in practical terms," she gestured, lightly, at the room, "is what this week is." He looked at her with the expression of someone assessing a response and finding it adequate, more than adequate. "And the Ashvale situation? Your uncle's pack? Your relationship with them going forward?" "My uncle has agreed to the formal acknowledgement process," she said. "I expect him to fulfill those commitments. He has practical reasons to do so, and he is, in the areas that matter for this, a practical man." She paused. "The pack itself, many of its members were as unaware as I was. The relationship with that community is something I intend to maintain, and I think they are open to maintaining it." "You're not angry at them," said a woman named Clara Vane, the youngest council member, early 50s, with the clear eyes of someone who asked direct questions and was comfortable with direct answers. "I'm not angry at the members who were living under the same suppressed information I was living under," Mara said. "I'm angry at the structural decisions that maintained the suppression. Those are different things." Clara Vane looked at her for a moment. Then she made a small note. The discussion that followed was dense with governance specifics, the procedural implications of a sovereign tier documentation in the current period, the formal relationship between the Continental Assembly's authority and the Keld Territory's procedural query, the question of what the historical precedents for Sovereign's Bind documentation implied about the holder's formal status in continental structures. Mara listened to most of it and spoke when she had something accurate to add, which was more often than she had expected. She had the clinical precision of someone who had spent years doing work that required getting things right, and that precision translated across domains in a way that she was only beginning to understand. After an hour, Riva Aldis called a short break. Mara went to the window at the edge of the chamber and looked out at the courtyard. She could feel the meeting in her body, the effort of full, sustained attention for an extended period in a high-stakes environment. She was not overwhelmed. She was aware. Eli Ward appeared beside her with 2 cups of tea from the refreshment table. She took one without ceremony. "You're doing well," he said quietly. "I'm doing adequately," she said. He almost smiled. "Gregor Fenn has not engaged that actively in a council agenda item in 18 months, he said. "He goes through the motions generally." She looked at Eli. He was genuinely curious. "Yes," Eli said. "About me or about the documentation?" "Both," Eli said, "but mostly about whether you were the kind of person the documentation implied you were." He paused. "He's deciding you are." She considered this. "What is the kind of person the documentation implies I am?" "Someone with significant heritage who has spent significant time in contexts that required capability without resources," Eli said. He said it like a definition. Historically, the people who carry that combination either become very useful or very difficult, sometimes both. He looked at her sideways. "He's deciding you're the useful kind." "I'm not doing it to be useful," she said. "I know," Eli said. "That's why he thinks you are." The break ended. They went back to the table. The afternoon was equally dense, and equally long, and equally worth every minute of it. By the time the council meeting concluded, the afternoon had gone gold through the high windows and Mara's right hand was ink-stained from the notes she had been keeping in her own shorthand in the margins of the agenda document Eli had provided. She looked at her hand and thought of Eli's fingers at dinner the night before and thought, "Welcome to the documentation section." Riva Aldous stopped her as people were gathering their materials to leave. "A moment," the older woman said. Mara waited. The room cleared. Calum gathered his papers and gave them a glance, and Riva Aldous gave him back a look, and then he left, which meant this conversation was intended to be the two of them. "I was on the council when the last Sovereign's Bind documentation was processed," Riva Aldous said. 41 years ago. I was very new then. Very junior." She was quiet for a moment. The person in that case was an older man from the northern pack lines. The documentation produced an enormous amount of procedural complexity, a great many institutional discussions, and a great deal of pressure on him from parties who found his status inconvenient. "What happened to him?" Mara said. "He managed it," Riva said. "He was competent, and he was clear about what he wanted from the process. And he managed it." She looked at Mara. "He also, if I'm being frank, found the weight of it quite significant. It is a significant thing to carry, being who the documentation says you are, inside an institution as old and complex as this one, with the history attached to it. It is not a small thing." "I know," Mara said. "I'm telling you this not to diminish anything," Riva said. "I'm telling you because I watched someone manage it well once, and I think the factors that made him manage it well are factors I see in you today, and I want you to know that I see them, so you don't feel that you're walking into a room full of people who are only assessing the challenge." She paused. "Some of us are assessing the person." Mara looked at her for a moment. "Thank you," she said. It was the second time today she had meant it fully. Riva Aldous nodded and left. Mara stood in the empty chamber for a moment. She looked at the round table. She thought about what Eli had said, the useful kind. She thought about what Riva had said, the person. She thought about 6 years of folding bandages and keeping her head down and showing up to things she did not want to attend. She thought, it was never nothing. None of it had been nothing. The bandages were not nothing. The healer's knowledge she had built without allocation or support was not nothing. The record she had quietly built for herself, inside a system that tried to prevent her from having one, was not nothing. It was exactly the preparation for this. Not in the way that suffering builds character, which was a formula she had always found too clean for the actual shape of difficulty, but in the specific, practical way that doing real work in real conditions builds a real person. And the real person was the one who was now sitting at a round table in the Continental Assembly and being told that the people in the room were assessing her and finding her adequate. More than adequate. She went to dinner. Eli was at the same table from the night before. He moved over slightly when she sat down, not far, just the small practical gesture of making room. Calum came in late and sat at the end of the same table, not beside her but in the same general orbit, and she ate her dinner and heard the room and made notes in her head about what she needed to read that evening and which council members she wanted to speak with more directly before the full assembly session began. After dinner, she stopped at the library. She stood for a moment in front of the history section and then moved to the medical and scientific section, because she had not forgotten what she told Calum in the vehicle, that the work in the infirmary was not something she was leaving behind. She pulled 2 volumes on the Continental Medical Oversight Framework and carried them back to her rooms under her arm. She had a lot to read. She sat at the desk under the lamp. She opened the first book. Outside, the courtyard was dark and quiet. The stars above the wall were bright with the particular brightness of cold, clear nights. Inside, the room was warm, and the lamp was steady, and the books were here. She read. And for the first time in 22 years, the reading was not compensating for something that had been taken from her. It was building toward something that was entirely her own. She could feel the difference. 3 days into her time at the Continental Assembly Complex, the Keld Territories procedural query received its formal response. Mara read it in the morning, in the library, with the second cup of tea that had become her reliable morning signal that the day had properly begun. The response was from the Continental Authority's Administrative Division, a department separate from Calum's direct authority, which was deliberate and appropriate. It stated, in the measured language of official documents, that the query had been reviewed and found to have insufficient evidentiary basis to initiate a formal challenge to the archive registration. The registration stood. The documentation was valid. She read it once. She put it down. She picked it up and read it again. Then she folded it carefully and put it with the other documents she was keeping. She sat in the library for a while after that. The morning was quiet. The complex was beginning to fill as more assembly representatives arrived ahead of the formal session, but the library at this hour was still mostly empty. Light came through the high windows and landed on the book spines in long, even strips. She thought about the procedural query. She thought about Arden Cole sitting somewhere in the Keld territory, receiving the same administrative response she had just read, and the adjustments that would follow. He would file something else, probably, not because he expected it to succeed, but because the record of opposition served certain purposes. She understood the logic. She was not going to waste energy on it. Eli Ward arrived at 8:30 with a folder of documents and his standard ink-stained fingers, and the mild but genuine look of someone who was glad to be where he was. "The full assembly session roster is finalized," he said, setting the folder on the table. "I thought you'd want the names before they become official." She took the folder. 38 packs, all represented. Territory advisors and specialist staff beside each name. It was a substantial amount of information. She began reading through it with the systematic attention she brought to everything that would eventually require recall. "Who are the 3 people I should know before I walk into that room?" she said. He pulled a chair. "Doran's counterpart in the Mel territory," he said. "Elder class, politically savvy, has historically aligned with the Eastern Territorial Bloc. His name is Gareth Rue. He's going to watch you very carefully, and he won't make it obvious." He paused. "Second would be the Ashwood Pack representative, a woman named Nora Fitch. She's a healer, the strongest practical medical voice in the assembly. She's going to care less about your lineage and more about what you've done with your hands." "And third?" "Third is Councilmember Fenn," Eli said. "He was assessing you 3 days ago. He's made up his mind. His support in the room is going to matter more than most people's, because he's been neutral for a long time, and the people who've been neutral for a long time have more credibility when they stop being neutral." She nodded. She looked at the roster. She found Gareth Rue's entry, found Nora Fitch's, found Gregor Fenn's, which she already knew. She went back to the beginning and kept reading. That afternoon, she met Nora Fitch. Not by arrangement, they were both in the medical section of the library at the same time, working in parallel without acknowledgement for 20 minutes, and then Nora Fitch put down her book, looked at Mara directly, and said, "The Ashvale Pack Infirmary has sent 2 referrals to the Continental Medical Network in the last 6 years. Both were handled correctly, and the documentation was thorough. Was that yours?" Mara looked up. "Yes." Nora Fitch was in her mid-50s, with short graying hair, and the particular physical presence of someone who had been working in practical medical settings for their entire professional life. She looked at Mara the way Mara imagined she looked at everything, with direct, undecorated attention. "Both cases were outside normal pack-level competency," Nora said. "The documentation on the second one, the differential diagnosis section, was good enough that my team cited it as an example in a training context." Mara was quiet for a moment. She had not known that. "Who taught you?" Nora said. "Nina Carr, the Ashvale Pack healer." "I know Nina's work," Nora said. "She's competent, but the differential diagnosis section was beyond what I'd expect from Nina's training approach." She paused. "So where did you learn it?" "Books, mostly," Mara said. "The ones I could get access to." Nora looked at her with an expression that was not quite approval and not quite something else. It occupied an interesting middle space. "How do you think about the relationship between lineage heritage and practical work?" It was an unusual question for an introduction. Mara thought about it genuinely. "I think they're different categories," she said. "What I carry in my lineage is something I was born with. What I learned to do in the infirmary is something I built. One is inheritance, the other is choice. I don't want to confuse them." Nora studied her. Then she nodded once, a short, decisive motion. "The Continental Medical Oversight Function," she said. "The advisory board is empty in 2 seats. The board meets quarterly. The work is primarily review and standard setting." She paused. "It's not glamorous work." "I know," Mara said. "Do you want it?" Mara looked at this woman who had been citing her work in training contexts without knowing whose it was. She looked at the medical volumes on the table between them. She thought about the words she had said to Caleb in the vehicle 3 days ago, that the work was not something she was willing to give up because of what it had been associated with. "Yes," she said, "if the appointment process supports it." "I'll support it," Nora said. Simply, with the quality of a person who made commitments accurately rather than abundantly. They sat in companionable quiet for a while after that, both reading, and Mara thought, this is also what it feels like. The evening before the full assembly session, she walked the grounds of the complex. The outdoor space behind the main building was more formal than the Ashvale compound's back garden. Stone paths, a series of winter bare hedges, a large open space that in warmer seasons was probably used for the kind of ceremonial gathering that an institution like this required from time to time. In winter it was simply space, wide and cold and very quiet. She was not surprised to find Calum there. She had a growing sense of where he was likely to be, which was a sense she had developed without intending to, and which she was still not entirely managing. She was aware of it the way she was aware of the mark at her shoulder, present, significant, not yet fully understood. He was walking the path that ran along the outer hedge, hands in his coat pockets. He heard her coming, as he always did, and turned before she was close. They walked together for a while without speaking. This had become a quality they had developed over the past week, the ability to be in silence together without the silence being something that needed to be filled. She valued it. She did not have many relationships in which silence was comfortable. "Nora Fitch wants me on the medical oversight board," she said after a while. "I know," he said. "She told me." "She told you." "She asked my view on whether it would conflict with anything in your formal continental status." Mara looked at him sideways. "Does it?" "No," he said. "A sovereign's bind documentation doesn't create obligations, it creates recognition. What you do with it is your own decision." "You told her that." "I told her that." She was quiet for a moment. "You've been doing that," she said. He looked at her, creating space and then stepping back from it, she said. "Not directing, not suggesting, but also not passive." She paused. "The round table in the council chamber. The word participant rather than subject. The book you left on my chest of drawers, Nora Fitch." She held his gaze. "You do it very deliberately." He was quiet for a moment. The path turned and they turned with it, the outer hedge close on one side and the wide open space of the grounds on the other. "You have spent your life in a context where people made decisions about your future without telling you," he said, "and then attributed the outcomes of those decisions to your own limitations." He looked forward, along the path. "I didn't want to be another version of that." She took that in. She held it with the same care she brought to things that were important and wanted to make sure she had accurately before responding. "You aren't," she said. He looked at her. "You aren't another version of that," she said. "I want to be clear about that." She paused. "And I want to be clear about something else. I am capable of identifying the difference between someone creating space for me and someone managing me. I have been doing that identification my entire life. You are in the first category." He held her gaze for a moment. Something moved in his expression. It was the same something that had moved at the beginning of the week. Brief, deep, not easily categorized. "I know," he said. They walked. The stars were out. The cold was serious and clean. The marks in the old Sutton history were in her room, and the archive document was in her desk drawer, and the carved wolf from Penn was on the bedside table, and the honey from Owen was in the cupboard. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow," he agreed. The full assembly session. The room she was going to walk into with her name and her mark and her 6 years of correctly documented referrals and her lineage convergence, and the book that Calum had left on her chest of drawers, and the notes she had made in 3 days of reading, and everything else she was. She was going to walk into it as herself. She was going to sit at the round table, or whatever table the full assembly used, and be exactly who she was, and it was going to be enough, because it had always been enough, and the only thing that had ever prevented it from being recognized as enough was a sealed notation in a pack archive, written by a man who was afraid of what the truth would cost him. The truth was no longer sealed. She pressed her hand briefly to her shoulder blade. The mark pulsed, warm and steady. Tomorrow. The full Continental Assembly convened at 9 in the morning. The chamber was larger than the council room. Considerably larger. It held the round table she had expected from the precedent of the council meetings, but this one was much bigger. Large enough for 38 PAC representatives and their immediate advisors, with additional seating on elevated tiers around the periphery for observers and specialist staff. The stone walls were the same plain heavy stone as the rest of the building. The windows were high and let in cold, clear light. Mara arrived 7 minutes early. The chamber was already filling. She took it in while she could still see it without people. The shape of the room, the arrangement of the table, where the doors were, where the note-takers sat, where the archival staff positioned themselves. She filed all of it. Then she found her seat. Her name was on a card, not a generic card. Her full name, Mara Voss, and beneath it, in the Continental Archive standard formatting, a status designation she was going to have to develop a relationship with. Sovereign Tier, Ashvale, Sutton Voss Line. She looked at the card. She sat down. People arrived. The room filled. She watched without watching. the kind of full-attention peripheral awareness she had developed in the infirmary, where you needed to track a room while your hands were doing something else. She identified Gareth Rue from Eli's description, a man in his late 60s across the table with the carefully neutral expression of someone taking comprehensive stock. She identified Nora Fitch 3 seats to her right, who gave her a brief nod of acknowledgement that was precise and professional, and therefore exactly right. She identified Gregor Fenn in his position on the council tier, settled and attentive, who caught her eye for one moment with the look of someone who had made his assessment and was comfortable with it. Calum came in last. The room did what it always did when he entered, shifted. Not dramatically, not with ceremony, a subtle attentional reorganization, the way a space responds when the person with the most authority walks into it. He moved to the head of the table, the head that was not a head, because the table was round, but that was functionally a head, because everyone's orientation shifted toward it, and stood. "This session is open," he said. He did not say more than was necessary. He sat. Riva Aldis took the convener's role, the same role she had held in the smaller council meeting. She went through the procedural opening with efficiency, and then moved to the first substantive agenda item. The first 3 items were existing business, territorial resource agreements, an ongoing border question between 2 eastern pacts that Mara did not yet have the context to fully follow, and a report from the Continental Health Infrastructure Review. She listened to all 3 carefully, asked no questions, and learned more in those 30 minutes about the actual texture of the Assembly's work than she had from any governance text. The 4th item was her documentation. Riva Aldis introduced it cleanly. The continental registration of a sovereign's bind lineage, the background of the suppression and its duration, the current status of the Keld procedural query and its resolution, and the formal question before the Assembly, which was the registration of Mara's status, and the Assembly's acknowledgement of what that status implied for continental record. Then she said, "Mara Voss is present and has asked to speak to the Assembly directly." This was not on the formal agenda. Mara had asked Celine the previous evening whether it was possible to request direct address, and Celine had taken the request to Riva Aldis, who had added it. The room's attention, which had been professional and attentive, became something more active. Mara stood. She had thought about what she was going to say. She had not written notes. Notes were for things you might need to be reminded of, and she was not going to forget what she meant to say. "I want to introduce myself," she said, "not as a documentation case, and not as a precedent, as a person." The room was quiet. "I am 22 years old. I have spent the last 6 years working as an infirmary aide in the Ashvale Pack. I have no formal healer certification, not because I lack the capability but because the allocation was denied under circumstances that you now have the documentation to understand. I have spent the last 10 days learning the extent to which my entire history had been constructed by other people's decisions." She paused. "I don't say this to produce sympathy. I say it because I think it is important, when someone walks into this room carrying documentation of significant heritage, that the room also knows who the person is behind the documentation." She looked at the table, at the 38 names on the cards around it. "What I want from this process is not special treatment or elevated status in ways that I have not demonstrated the capacity to use responsibly. What I want is what I have wanted for 22 years without being able to claim it, acknowledgement of what is actually true." She stopped. "I carry a sovereign's bind. My lineage converges 2 founding lines that have not been in direct combination for over a century. These things are facts. They are now documented facts. I am not asking this Assembly to give me anything. I am asking it to see what is already there." She sat down. The silence lasted 3 seconds. In a formal setting, 3 seconds was a long time. Then Gregor Fenn said, in his careful and precise way, "I would like to state, for the record, that the quality of this Assembly's response to documented lineage heritage has historically reflected the quality of our institutional values. We have an opportunity here to reflect those values clearly." He was not looking at Gareth Rue when he said it, but the statement had an address. Gareth Rue was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The Mel territory formally acknowledges the Continental Archive registration and withdraws any prior internal reservations regarding its validity." He said it with the delivery of someone who had measured his words carefully and found the exact minimum necessary, but he said it. That was the thing. The formal motion for acknowledgement was put. It passed. All 38 votes. Mara sat at the table while the votes were recorded, and felt the warmth at her shoulder blade doing something she did not have language for. Not stronger exactly. Steadier. The way a fire steadies when the last uncertain factor is resolved, and it can simply burn. After the session, the room took a long time to clear. People wanted to speak with her, not all of them, but enough of them, and the conversations were substantive, not performative interest, not the social choreography of an institution managing a new situation. Real conversations, with people who were genuinely engaging with the question of who she was and what her presence in this room meant. Nora Fitch stopped beside her on the way out and said, "The Oversight Board appointment will go to the Administrative Committee next week. I filed the recommendation. Efficient, complete, exactly the right amount of words." Eli was at the note-taker's position and gave her a brief nod as she passed. She returned it. Gregor Fenn caught her in the corridor outside the chamber. He was moving slowly. His age was more visible out of the formal setting than in it, but his mind was clearly not slow in the slightest. "The man from the Northern Territories," he said. "The one Riva mentioned. The last Sovereign's Bind documentation, 41 years ago." "She told me about him," Mara said. "I knew him," Gregor said. "Not well. But I was young and in a minor staff role, and I watched what happened in that assembly when he arrived." He was quiet for a moment. What he found most difficult was not the procedural complexity or the territorial opposition. It was the question of what to do with a life when the constraints on it are suddenly removed. He looked at her steadily. He had spent 30 years building a life around the constraints. When they went, he found the space they left behind rather larger than he had anticipated. Mara looked at him. "What happened to him?" "He managed," Gregor said. "He was like you in that respect. He managed." He paused. "I'm telling you because I've watched people manage things my whole professional life, and the ones who manage best are the ones who understand that managing doesn't mean you don't feel the weight of it. It means you feel it and proceed." "Yes," she said. He nodded. He went. She stood in the corridor for a moment. The stone floor was cold through her shoes. The light from the high windows was still clear and even. She thought about what Gregor had said, the space left behind when constraints are removed. She thought about her room upstairs, with the Sutton history on the desk, and the carved wolf on the bedside table, and the medical texts she had been reading every evening. She thought about the Medical Oversight Board, and the work it would require. Real work, the kind of work that her hands already understood. She thought about what it was going to mean to build a life in this place. Not the constraints version, not the making the best of it version, the actual version. It was large. He was right. It was considerably larger than she had anticipated, even though she had been preparing for it. She was going to need a while to stand in the middle of it before she could see its full shape. She walked back toward the main wing. She was going to get tea. Then she was going to go to the library. Then she was going to sit at the desk in her room and write a letter to Nina, because Nina had asked her to, and because Nina deserved a real account of what had happened, and Mara had been trained by Nina to be accurate about important things. She was going to write the letter carefully. Then she was going to read. Then she was going to sleep. And tomorrow she was going to get up and do all of the next things that were coming, because they were hers to do, and she was going to do them. That was what managing looked like. She knew it. She had always known it. Now she just had more space to do it in. She went and got the tea. The letter to Nina took longer than expected, not because the words were hard to find, but because finding the right ones for what had happened required a precision that Mara held herself to. She wrote 3 drafts at the desk under the lamp, discarding the first because it was too much like a report, the second because it tilted into something that felt like performing the magnitude of events rather than simply describing them. The third draft was accurate. It told Nina about the council meeting and the formal session. It told her about Nora Fitch and the Medical Oversight Board. It told her about Eli Ward and the Historical Archive and the governance texts, and the 3 days of reading before the assembly convened. It told her about the vote and Gregor Fenn and what he had said in the corridor about the man from 41 years ago. Then she stopped and looked at the page and thought about what else was true. She wrote, "The work is larger than I expected. Not the governance work, the work of deciding what to do with a life when the version of it you had been constructing is revealed to have been built in a much smaller room than you thought." She stopped again. She wrote, "I think I will be all right." She sealed the letter and addressed it to Nina Carr, Ashvale Pack Infirmary, and left it on the desk to be sent in the morning. Then she sat for a while without reading anything, which was unusual for her. She was thinking about Calum. She was thinking about him specifically and deliberately, because she had spent the better part of the week thinking about him in the oblique and slightly avoidant way that she thought about things she did not know how to categorize, and she was going to be more direct with herself about it. He had been a fixed point in a week that had been almost entirely unfixed, not because she had needed a fixed point. She had been her own fixed point for 22 years, but because there was a difference between managing without support and having support available, and she had not had extensive experience with the second category. She thought about the stool. She thought about the vehicle. 3 days of dense and productive conversation. The book on the chest of drawers. The provisional hold filed in 20 minutes before the morning had fully begun. The word participant. The statement today is your concern, not mine. When Cole had looked for his authority to manage her. She thought about the garden walk last night, and the way he had said you have been in that context, exactly and plainly, and then looked at her when she said you aren't another version of that, and held the look with something in it that she was increasingly sure about the nature of. She knew what it was. She had known what it was for several days. She was 22 years old and she had spent her life making do with what she had, and what she had included an extremely limited experience of relationships of any kind beyond the functional ones. But she was also 22 years old and not unobservant, and she knew what it looked like when someone looked at you with that specific quality of attention. The question was what to do with that knowledge. She thought about it practically, as she thought about most things. He was the alpha king of the continental packs. She was, as of today, a sovereign tier documented lineage holder, and a prospective member of the Medical Oversight Board. These were not incompatible positions in any formal sense. She had read enough governance history in the last 3 days to know that the relationship between people of different continental positions was not regulated in the way that certain other things were regulated. She thought about it in the less practical way, too. She thought about what it felt like to be in the same space as him, and the specific quality of the way he listened, and the way he said things plainly without apology and without flourish, and the way he had sat on the stool. She thought about the enormous and somewhat terrifying amount of space that had opened up in her life in the last 10 days, and the question of what she was going to do with all of it. She put on her coat. She went downstairs. The nighttime complex was quiet. The main areas were dimly lit, the kind of lighting that said the building was occupied but not at full operation. She walked through it without a specific destination, which was unusual for her. She usually knew exactly where she was going, but she was navigating by something other than intention, and she let that guide her for once. He was in the small reading room adjacent to the main library. She had not looked for him there specifically. She had walked through the library door because the library was where her feet took her, and the reading room door was ajar, and he was at the table with a single lamp and a spread of documents, and the same composed focus that was his resting expression. He looked up. She said, "I was going to get another book." "The section you want is on the second shelf from the right," he said. "Third row." She went and got the book. She came back. She stood in the doorway of the reading room. "Sit down," he said. She sat across from him at the small table. He moved some of the documents to the side to make room, with the easy practical gesture of someone who was comfortable in shared working spaces. They sat for a while without speaking, both reading, the lamp between them casting the kind of steady and unbothered light that lamps had no opinions about. "I wrote to Nina," she said after a while. "Good," he said. "I told her about the assembly session." "Good." "I also wrote," she stopped. He looked up. She looked at her book, which she had not actually been reading for the last 5 minutes. "I wrote that the work is larger than I expected," she said. "Deciding what to do with a life when the version of it you had has changed significantly." He was quiet. "I've been thinking about that," she said. "What I want the version to look like." "What have you decided?" She looked at him. He held the look in the way he always held her looks, steady, direct, without performing it. "The Medical Oversight Board, if the appointment goes through," she said. "I want to do that work. I want to do it well. I want the medical framework of this assembly to be better than it currently is, and I think I can contribute to making it better." She paused. "I want to stay connected to Ashvale, not in the way I was. I am not going back to that room and that stool and the life I had there, because that life was built on a suppression that no longer exists. But the pack is real, and the people in it are real, and I have relationships there that matter to me." He was listening. "And," she said. She stopped. She looked at her book again. Then she made herself look up. "I don't know how to do this," she said, with the direct honesty she brought to things she was clear about being uncertain of. "I have significant experience being in situations where the correct approach was not immediately apparent, and the strategy I've always used is to gather information before acting. But I think in this particular situation, gathering more information indefinitely is a way of not acting, which is a different kind of thing." She held his gaze. "I'd like to know what you want." The room was very quiet. He set down the document in his hand. "I want," he said slowly, "to have this conversation properly, not in a room we walked into by accident at 11 at night." He looked at her. "Tomorrow, will you have dinner with me? Not in the main dining room." She looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said. He nodded. She went back to her book. He went back to his documents. The lamp continued with its unbothered quality. Outside, somewhere, the complex settled around them with the nighttime sounds of an old stone building. When she left to go back to her room an hour later, he said, "Sleep well." She said, "You too." She walked upstairs with the book under her arm, and the warm and steady mark at her shoulder, and the feeling of a person who has been walking carefully for a very long time, and has just, for the first time, felt the ground beneath them settle. She slept better than she had in years. She was not sure she would ever be able to explain to anyone exactly why, but she understood it. Some things had simply stopped waiting to be resolved, and the waiting being over was its own kind of rest. The dinner was in a small private room off the main corridor that Mara had not noticed before, which told her something about how much she was still learning the layout of the building she now lived in. The room was plain and warm, with a table meant for four set for two, and a window that looked out over the east side of the complex where the hedges made dark shapes against the evening sky. No ceremony in the arrangement. A practical room being used for a practical purpose, which was exactly what she would have wanted if she had been asked. She had not been asked, because he had known. That was the kind of detail she was going to have to get used to, how quickly he read what she needed. She was not sure yet whether that quality was primarily experience or something more specific to her specifically, and she was not going to examine it right now because the evening had a purpose and she intended to be present for it. He was there when she arrived. He stood when she came in, which was not the performance it would have been in a formal context. It was the ordinary social gesture of someone who had been raised to do it and did it without thinking. She sat. He sat. There was food already on the table. "I'm going to tell you something first," she said, "and then you can say what you wanted to say." He waited. "I have no experience with this," she said. "I want to be clear about that as a fact, not as a limitation. I have spent 22 years making my own space in a context that did not offer me much room, and the space I made was very defined and very specific, and did not include this particular category of thing." She looked at him. "I know what I feel. I am not uncertain about that. I am uncertain about the process of it, because the process is new." He held her gaze steadily. "Is that a concern you're naming or a condition you're setting?" "It's information," she said. "I give people information that I think is relevant. It's a habit." "It's a good habit," he said. She waited. He was quiet for a moment, the way he was quiet when he was finding the accurate version of a thing, rather than the available version. She had learned to read that particular quality of his pauses. "I want to tell you what I have known since the moment I walked into the Ashvale ceremony," he said. "Not to burden you with a timeline, but because I think you are the kind of person who wants the actual facts, not the version that's been made tidier." "Yes," she said. "I knew when I read your file 3 months ago that the person inside that file was significant, not in the lineage sense, in the person sense. The thing Eli said to you about the documentation being the opening, and the person being the argument." He paused. "I knew before I got to Ashvale that the person was going to be an argument." She thought about that. "You came to the ceremony prepared for me to be someone specific." "I came prepared for the possibility," he said. "And then you were standing on that dais with your hand against your own shoulder and the whole room watching, and your face at a calm I recognized from the file. The calm of someone who has been managing impossible situations for a very long time. And I understood that the possibility was the reality." She looked at him. "The week since then," he said, "has been—" He stopped. He looked at the table for a moment, then he looked back up. "I have spent 10 years in this role. I have been in rooms that required everything from me, and I have been in rooms that required nothing at all. And the range of those experiences has been enough that I understand most rooms I walk into fairly quickly." He paused. "I do not know what to do with the room that contains you. That is not a common experience for me." The window's reflection held the room doubled. Her face, and his, and the table between them, and the lamp. She looked at his face in the reflection, and then at his face in the room. "That is a very honest thing to say," she said. "I am trying to say it well," he said. "You are," she said. They ate, and talked, and the conversation moved easily in the way their conversations had always moved. One of them saying something that opened into a question, and the question going somewhere real. She talked about the Medical Oversight Board, and the things she had read in the last 3 days about the Continental Health Framework, and what she thought it was actually missing. He listened in the way he listened, fully, without filling the space her words left before she had finished leaving it. He talked about the assembly and the specific challenges of the current period, and the things he had not been able to address yet because the coalition he needed had not been assembled. She asked him about the northern packs, because there had been a reference in the governance text she had read that she did not fully understand, and he answered her, and then they went 3 more exchanges deep into that topic before they surfaced. She thought, this is what it is. This is the actual shape of it. Not a ceremony. A conversation. A long, real, unperformed conversation with a person who was genuinely interested in the same kind of accuracy she was interested in. When the dinner had been going for a while, there was a quiet between them that was different from the other quiets. She recognized it by its specific quality, the kind of quiet that exists when 2 people have been talking and the talking has reached a point where the next thing is not more talking. You said I could tell you what I wanted, he said. Yes, she said. I want this, he said. This conversation, this room. The possibility of the conversation continuing beyond tonight. He looked at her. I am not placing conditions on your decisions about your work or your life here. I am also not pretending that the other thing is not present. She absorbed this. The other thing. What this is, he said. Between us. She held his gaze. What is it? She said. Not uncertainty. A real question, asked of him specifically. He looked at her for a long moment. Something I have not felt before, he said. In this form. With this quality. He paused. I recognize that that is a large statement, and I am not in the habit of making large statements carelessly. No, she said. I've noticed that about you. Then you know I mean it. I know you mean it. She agreed. She thought about the enormous space that had opened up in her life. She thought about what Gregor Fenn had said, the space left behind when constraints are removed being larger than anticipated. She thought about being 22 years old, which was not old, and being in a room with someone who said, I have not felt this before in this form with this quality, and meaning it, and her knowing he meant it. She thought about the practical things, his position, her position, the newness of all of it, the reasonable concerns that a person with good judgment would have about moving too fast into something that was simultaneously very new and felt, in a specific way she could not entirely account for, not new at all. She thought about all of that. Then she said, I want this conversation to continue beyond tonight. He did not smile. He did something quieter and more permanent than smiling. She registered it, and registered that she would remember that expression, specifically. Good, he said. I also want, she said, to be clear about something. What I want from the next period of my life. The work, the assembly, the medical oversight board, the questions I have not finished asking about my own lineage and my mother's. Those things are not dependent on this. They are mine already. This is something additional. Yes, he said. I know that. I would not have it be otherwise. Then we understand each other, she said. Yes, he said. I think we do. The evening moved into night. They stayed in the room for longer than dinner required, because the conversation kept finding new ground and neither of them was inclined to end it artificially. When she finally left, walking back through the quiet night-lit corridor toward her room, the building was deep in its nighttime sounds and the stars were out above the courtyard, and the mark at her shoulder was warm and she felt, in her whole body, the specific feeling that was different from everything that had come before it. Not arrival. That word was still ahead of her somewhere, but closer to arrival than to departure. She went to her room. She sat at the desk. She looked at the Sutton history. She opened it to the entry about Lyra Sutton, 9 generations back, who had left a pack that would not acknowledge her, and built something new in the Western Territories. She thought she would understand this. She thought she would recognize it. She closed the book. She went to sleep. Outside, the night was cold and clear, and the stars were doing what stars do, and the old stone building held its quiet, and somewhere in the room 2 corridors over, the Alpha King of the Continental Pax was presumably also going to sleep, and none of this was what Mara Voss had expected her life to be. She was very glad it was. 2 weeks into her life at the Continental Assembly Complex, a letter arrived from Calder Voss. She read it at the desk in the morning, before going to the library, and before her now regular morning conversation with Eli Ward, who had become something like a colleague, in the way that people who work in the same intellectual territory and respect each other's rigor become colleagues. The letter was formally structured and carefully written, which told her that he had drafted it more than once. Calder Voss was a man who expressed himself easily in person and with more difficulty in writing, which meant a carefully drafted letter was a significant effort. He wrote that the formal pack acknowledgement had been completed. He listed what it contained: full unsealing of Claire Voss's records, placement of the lineage notation in the primary archive under Mara's name, a signed statement from himself and Elder Doran describing the circumstances of the original suppression and the reasons it had been maintained. He wrote that the pack council had been told. He did not describe how those conversations had gone. She thought she could guess the range. He wrote, near the end, "The pack has asked about you. Penn specifically. Several others. I told them you were well." She folded the letter. She sat with it for a moment. She thought about the pack, about the compound she had walked on her last evening there, taking it in deliberately, about the infirmary and the pine smell, about Owen's honey in the cupboard, which she had opened twice in 2 weeks, and which was very good honey. She thought about the fact that she had left without saying everything she might have said, not because she could not think of the words, but because she had been in transition, and transitions required focus, and the words could wait. She got out her writing paper. She wrote to Penn first. The letter to Penn was easier than the letter she had written to Nina, not because it required less care, but because she knew exactly what Penn needed: honesty about what this place was like, and honesty about what it felt like to be in it, without performing anything. She told Penn about the round table in the assembly session. She told Penn about Nora Fitch. She told Penn that the carved wolf was on the bedside table and that she had looked at it on the first morning and thought of the yard and the people who had stood in it. She told Penn, "Keep going. Whatever you are doing that is hard, keep going. That's the advice I would have given myself at 17. She wrote to the infirmary. The letter to the infirmary was addressed to Nina, and also, she noted at the top, to anyone else in the building who wanted to read it. She described the medical oversight board appointment, which had gone through the administrative committee the previous week. She described the first advisory meeting, which had been dense and productive, and had surfaced 3 significant gaps in the continental standard-setting framework that she was going to spend the next month working through with Nora Fitch. She wrote, "I think this is useful work. I think it is the right work. I don't know yet if it is the full shape of what I am going to do with the years ahead, but it is where I am starting, and it is real work, and I am doing it well." Nina would recognize the doing it well. The approach is the same. She did not write about anything else. The letter was to the infirmary and the people in it, and it held what those people needed to know. She sealed both letters. She went to the library. Eli was already there, 2 books open in front of him and a cup of tea from the morning service. He looked up when she came in and moved the books to make the space she had come to occupy each morning. "There's a request," he said, without preamble. "From who?" "Gareth Rue. He wants a meeting with you." He looked at her. He filed the Mel Territory's formal acknowledgement in the assembly session. Now he wants a direct conversation. She thought about that. What does he want to discuss? He didn't say specifically. He said he wanted to discuss the Keld relationship and the Eastern Bloc's position in the current period. Eli paused. "He is also, I think, someone who assessed you in that chamber and wants to see more of the assessment, to be sure of his read." "Set it up," she said. "For when?" "Tomorrow afternoon," she said. "An hour. In a room where we're on equal footing, not his space or mine." Eli made a note. "There's a meeting room on the 2nd level, neutral." "That works." He went back to his book. She pulled the volume she had been reading and opened it. The library was warm and quiet, and the morning was doing what it did at this point in the season, coming in at an angle that was not quite winter, and not quite anything else. "Eli," she said. He looked up. "When the Sutton line broke off from the main pack structure 9 generations ago, what does the historical record actually say about why? Not the formal record. What does the documented internal correspondence say?" He looked at her for a moment, then he stood up. "Section 8, he said. 3rd shelf. There's a collection of pre-formal structure correspondence that isn't in the main catalog. Someone donated it 40 years ago and it was shelved without indexing." She stared at him. "I know where most of what isn't indexed is," he said, with the complete unself-consciousness of someone very comfortable with their own expertise. "Come, I'll show you." She followed him to Section 8, and he found the collection without hesitation, and pulled 3 volumes, and she looked at them, and felt the familiar thing she felt in the library, the specific excitement of information that had been waiting to be found. "I'll need a few hours," she said. "The morning is yours," he said. She sat down with the volumes and read. The months that followed had a shape she could not have predicted. The medical oversight board work was exactly what she had thought it would be. Dense, practical, requiring the combination of clinical knowledge and administrative precision that she had apparently been building, without knowing she was building it, for years. She worked well with Nora Fitch, who was direct and rigorous, and not interested in softening difficult conclusions, and who treated Mara as a peer in the specific and irreplaceable way that comes from working alongside someone whose judgment you actually trust. The assembly sessions gave her a different kind of work. The political texture of 38 packs and their complicated relationships, the long game of building trust in rooms that contained people who needed time to be certain of their assessments. Gareth Rue turned out to be someone she respected, which she had not expected. He was not dishonest. He was someone whose interests had previously aligned with suppression, and whose interests were now in a more complex position, and he was managing the complexity with more integrity than she might have given him credit for. The Keld territory filed 2 more procedural queries. Both were resolved in the same way the first one had been resolved. Arden Cole sent a formal communication at the end of the 3rd month, acknowledging the documentation and requesting clarification on the Eastern Territorial Alliance structure going forward. She handled the communication through proper channels and let the proper channels produce the appropriate response. She went back to Asheville twice. The first time was 6 weeks after she left. She went to the compound on a day when Calder was in a council meeting, which was deliberate. She wanted to see the place without the layer of his presence. She went to the infirmary. She sat on the stool with Nina and drank tea and described, in real terms, what the months had been. Penn was at the desk in the corner doing her first formal training work, because Nina had decided after Mara left that the training allocation was not something that needed to be run through the formal approval process for the time being, and Calder had not objected, and so Penn was training. "Is it what you expected?" Penn said. Mara looked at her. "No," she said. "It's larger than I expected. The work is real, and the people are real, and the complications are real." She paused. "But the thing I thought I was working toward, being seen accurately, in a place where that accuracy could mean something, that part is exactly what I expected." Penn nodded. She went back to her work. Nina walked Mara to the gate when she left. The pine trees were starting to show the first green of spring at their tips. The air smelled the way Asheville always smelled in the early part of the year. "You look well," Nina said. "I am well," Mara said. Nina gave her the same look she had given her from the beginning of Mara's time in the infirmary. The look of a person who was seeing the full version of someone else, rather than the version they presented for general consumption. "The Alpha King," Nina said. Mara said nothing. "I don't need details," Nina said. "I just want to know that it is what it looks like from where I'm standing." Mara considered this. "What does it look like?" "It looks like something true," Nina said. "Something that was found rather than arranged." Mara looked at the pine trees. She thought about the reading room at 11 at night. She thought about the dinner, and the conversation that had gone 3 exchanges deeper into the northern packs than either of them had planned. She thought about the way he had looked when she told him that she wanted the conversation to continue beyond tonight, and what she had learned about that particular expression in the weeks since. "Yes," she said, "that's accurate." Nina nodded. She pulled Mara into a brief, matter-of-fact embrace, not demonstrative, not long. The kind of embrace that communicated everything it needed to without extending past the communication. Then she let go. "Come back when you can," she said. "I will," Mara said. She left. She walked to the vehicle where Ivan was waiting, and she did not look back at the compound, because she did not need to look back. The compound was in her, the pine smell and the infirmary and the cold stone floor and all of it, and it was not going anywhere, and neither was she. She was going forward. The vehicle moved onto the road. She watched the territory open up in front of her. She pressed her hand to her shoulder blade. The mark pulsed, warm and absolutely steady. She thought, "There you are." She thought, "We've come a long way." She looked out the window at the road ahead, which was wide and clear and leading toward a life that was, at last, entirely hers. The Second Continental Assembly full session of the year convened in the early autumn, 6 months after the first. The room was the same room. The table was the same table. The light through the high windows was different. A warmer angle, early autumn gold rather than winter clear. 38 packs, fully represented. The elevated tiers full of specialist staff and advisors. The note-takers in their positions. Eli Ward at the archival station with his ink-stained fingers and his complete knowledge of where every unindexed document in the library was. Mara arrived 7 minutes early. She sat in her seat. Her name card was the same. Mara Voss, Sovereign Tier, Ashevale, Sutton Voss Line. She had sat in this seat once before, and stood and said what she said, and the room had voted, and the vote had been unanimous. Today she was not an agenda item. Today she was presenting. The Medical Oversight Board's first formal report to the full assembly had been 6 months in preparation. She and Nora had worked through every standard in the current framework, identified the gaps, consulted with pack-level medical practitioners across 12 packs to understand what the experience of the framework actually was on the ground, and then written the recommendations with the precision that both of them brought to the written word. She had the report in front of her. She was not going to read from it. She knew it well enough that reading from it would be a reduction. She was going to say it in the plain, accurate way she said things, and the room was going to hear it, and then she was going to answer the questions that came, and the answers were going to be equally plain and equally accurate. She was not nervous. She was the thing that 22 years of doing difficult work in difficult conditions had produced, a person who was completely prepared for the moment she was in. The chamber filled. Calum came in last. He found her in the room immediately. He always found her immediately. She met the look for 1 second, the look that had the quality it had always had, from the first time across a crowded ceremony hall, and then the session opened and both of them were in the room in their professional capacities, which was also simply who they were. The separation of those two things, who he was to her, and who he was in the room, was something she had found easier than expected, because the person in the room was not a different person. He was the same person who had sat on a wooden stool and waited for her to organize her thoughts. The professional quality and the personal quality were parts of the same thing, and she did not need to choose between them. They coexisted. She had learned that from him, in part. He was very good at coexistence. The session moved through its agenda. She listened and engaged and spoke when she had something accurate to contribute, which was more often now than in the first session because she had 6 months of context. She knew the names, she knew the history of the positions. She knew, when someone said something, what the 3 things beneath it were that they were not saying. When they reached the Medical Oversight Board's report on the agenda, Nora introduced the item and then said, "I'll ask Mara Voss to present the substance of the report." Mara stood. She gave the presentation in 22 minutes. She covered the gaps in the current framework, the evidence from the ground-level consultations, the 3 primary recommendations and the reasoning behind each. She was specific, she was plain. She did not perform the importance of the material. She trusted the material to carry its own importance. When she finished, the questions came. Gregor Fenn asked 2 questions, both of which were exactly the right questions, the questions that probed the assumptions behind the second recommendation. She answered them fully. Gareth Rue asked 1 question about the resource implications for smaller packs. She gave him an answer that was frank about the short-term cost and specific about the long-term benefit, because that was the accurate answer and there was no useful version of a less accurate one. A woman from one of the northern packs, a name Mara had not previously interacted with, asked a question about the consultation process and whether the ground-level practitioners had been given adequate time to engage with the proposed standards before the recommendations were finalized. It was a good challenge. Mara acknowledged it as a good challenge and explained what the timeline had been, and what had been taken into account and what had not been, and said plainly that the implementation process should include a further consultation round, for exactly the reason the question raised. The woman from the northern pack made a note. The formal vote on adopting the recommendations passed with 34 in favor, 2 abstentions, and 2 requesting further review on specific items. Both requests for further review were reasonable, and she had anticipated them. Nora would handle the follow-up. Mara sat down. The session continued. She was present for the rest of it with the full attention she brought to everything, and she followed the discussions and made notes and thought about the things that would need to happen as a result of the various items, and then the session concluded, and the chamber began to clear. She stayed in her seat for a moment. She thought about the first time she had been in this room, standing up and saying, "I want to introduce myself," the way the room had gone quiet with the quality of attention that was not performance. She thought about 6 months ago and 6 months of work and the specific satisfaction of work that had been done thoroughly and well. Not the satisfaction of recognition, that was real but it was secondary. The primary satisfaction was the work itself, always had been, always would be. Nora appeared beside her. "Good presentation," she said. "The timing was right, and the challenge on the northern question was handled correctly." "Thank you," Mara said. "The next cycle," Nora said. "I want to expand the consultation to include the eastern packs. Gareth Rue's question about smaller pack resources is a genuine gap in the current model." "Agreed," Mara said. "I'll start the process next week." Nora nodded and left, the movement of someone who had completed the relevant portion of a day and was moving to the next. Eli was at her shoulder a moment later. He had the expression of a man who had something to tell her and was deciding on the right sequence. "The unindexed collection in Section 8, he said. She turned fully to look at him. "There's a 3rd volume, he said. "I found it last week. It was shelved inside another binding. I've been reading it." He paused. There's correspondence between the Sutton line and the founding assembly members from the third generation, 17 letters. They reference the sovereign's bind directly, not as an abstract concept, specifically, describing what it meant for the women in the Sutton line who carried it. She stared at him. Women, she said. 3 of them. Documented. Going back to the original divergence. He looked at her steadily. The bind in your lineage is specifically matrilineal on the Sutton side. It has passed through the women. She stood up from the chair. Library, she said. I thought so, he said. They went to the library together, and she sat at the reading table with the 3rd volume and the winter gold light through the high windows and the ink-smelling quiet of a room full of accumulated knowledge, and she read. The letters were between women she was descended from, and men who had been building the institutional structures she now sat inside. They wrote with the directness of people who did not have time for the kind of language that decorated difficulty, and what they said was specific and real, and carried across 2 centuries with the sharpness of things written in full honesty. They wrote about the bind, what it felt like to carry it, what it cost, what it gave, the warmth at the shoulder blade that was described in language she recognized, word for word, because it was the same warmth, the steadiness of it, the way it functioned as orientation rather than burden. One of them, 5 generations back, a woman named Della Sutton who had married into the founding Eastern Pack and lived there for 30 years, wrote a letter to her daughter that Mara read 3 times. She did not read it out to anyone. It was not public material. But she sat with it for a long time and felt the line of women running from that letter to this table. Through her mother who had known and been careful and taught without naming what she was teaching. Through the grandmother she had never met. Through the generations of women who had carried this thing in a world that oscillated between acknowledging it and suppressing it, and who had kept going regardless. She felt the warmth at her shoulder blade pulse with the steady quality it had held since the day the seal had touched her on the dais. She thought, 5 generations at least. 5 generations of women carrying exactly this, in this form. Finding their own version of the next thing to do. Building their version of the space they needed. She thought about the 19-year-old girl who had walked into the Ashevale infirmary for the first time, and asked Nina what the medicines were for. She thought, she was always part of this line. She had always been exactly where she was supposed to be. That evening, she stood in the courtyard outside the main wing with her hands in her coat pockets and looked at the sky. The autumn stars were out, a different arrangement than the winter ones she'd arrived under, familiar now in the way that things you have looked at consistently from the same place become familiar, not the deep familiarity of a lifetime, but the beginning of it. She heard his steps behind her. She did not turn until he was beside her, because she had learned she did not need to. Long day, he said. Good day, she said. He was quiet, looking up at the same sky. Eli found another volume, she said. From the unindexed section, there are letters, from the Sutton women. She paused. Della Sutton, 5 generations back, wrote to her daughter about the bind. She described it exactly as I would describe it. He looked at her. She also wrote, Mara said slowly, that the bind did not come with a map, that the mark told you who you were, not where you were going, and that the where you were going was entirely the work of the person carrying it. She looked at the stars. She wrote that she thought this was the correct arrangement. He was quiet for a moment. Do you think so? She thought about it. Yes, she said. I think the where you're going should be yours. I think it wouldn't mean the same thing if it came already decided. He was quiet again, in the way he was quiet when he was thinking rather than waiting. Where are you going? He said. Not a push. A genuine question, asked by someone who was interested in the answer, and was not going to supply it. She thought about the letter she had sent to Penn. She thought about the Medical Oversight Board and the next cycle of consultation, and Gareth Rue's question about smaller pack resources, which was a real question that deserved a real answer. She thought about the letters in the unindexed collection and the things she still had left to read in them. She thought about the second visit to Ashevale she was planning, in which she was going to ask Calder about her mother's early years and he was going to tell her, because it was information she was owed and he knew that now. She thought about this courtyard. She thought about the person beside her. I'm going here, she said, and forward from here, in the direction I choose. She looked at him. That's the most accurate answer I have right now. He looked at her for a moment, the same expression she had registered at the dinner, the quiet and permanent thing that was not a smile but was more lasting than one. Then I'm glad you're here, he said. She held his gaze. I know, she said. They stood in the autumn star dark for a while, the 2 of them, in a courtyard that was becoming familiar, in a building that was becoming hers, in a life that was opening with a wideness she was still learning to walk around inside of. The mark at her shoulder was warm. It was always warm now. She pressed her hand to it once, briefly, the way she had pressed it on the dais on the morning everything changed, and felt it pulse against her palm, steady as breathing, certain as her own name. Then she put her hand back in her coat pocket and looked at the stars, and let the evening be exactly what it was. A courtyard, a cold night, a sky full of stars that had been there before she arrived and would be there after she went to sleep and would be there again when she woke up and began the next part of what she was building. She thought about Della Sutton's letter and the line of women who had carried the same warmth in their shoulder blades through 2 centuries of different worlds and different rooms and different versions of the same essential question. What do you do with what you carry? You carry it forward. You use it. You make of it something real. Mara Voss had been 22 years old, and lowest tier, and invisible in a compound that smelled of pine smoke, and she had stood on a dais with her hand against her own back, and everything had changed. She was still 22. She was going to be 23 in 3 weeks. She had a medical oversight board to run and letters to read and a presentation to prepare for the smaller pack consultation, and a visit to Ashvale to plan, and approximately 40 more questions to ask the man standing beside her before she ran out, which was going to take some considerable time. She was going to use all of it. She was, at last, exactly who she had always been, and the world was finally looking at her and seeing it. The autumn moved into the deeper part of itself over the following weeks. The consultation process for the Eastern Packs began on schedule. She worked through the list of practitioners with the same systematic attention she had brought to every list she had ever worked through, and found, as she always found, that the most useful information came from the people who did not expect to be asked and therefore answered without the performance of someone prepared. A healer from one of the smaller Eastern Packs, a man named Ray Dodd who had been practicing in a 3-family pack compound for 20 years, with equipment that predated the current continental standards by a significant margin, described the actual conditions of his work in a way that made the gaps in the framework visible with the clarity of direct experience. She sat in the small room where they conducted the consultation and listened to him with the full attention she had learned in 6 years of sitting beside people who needed to be heard, and when she wrote her notes afterward, the notes were long and specific, and built directly from what he had said, rather than from what the formal framework suggested he should have said. "You listened differently than the last oversight representative did," Ray Dodd said, near the end of the consultation. "How did the last one listen?" she said. "Like someone who knew what they expected to hear and was waiting for confirmation of it," he said. "Not bitterly, just accurately." She noted that as well. Nora Fitch read the consultation notes and circled 3 sections and wrote next to them, in the direct marginal script she used for things she found important. "This is what we were missing." She did not elaborate. She did not need to. The letter from Calder arrived in the middle of October. It was shorter than the first one, and less formally structured, which meant it was the version that had gotten past the self-consciousness of official correspondence. He wrote about the pack, briefly. He wrote that the Eastern Alliance was being renegotiated, which was a significant administrative task, but one that he felt the pack was positioned to manage. He wrote that Penn's training was going well, and that she had a gift for the diagnostic work specifically. He wrote at the end, "I have been thinking about what you said in the council room, about whether the protection was for you or for the Alliance. I think you were right that both things were true. I also think you were right that you deserve to know which was primary. I am not certain I could give you a clear answer even now. I am not sure the 2 things were separable in the way that would make one primary. I'm telling you this because I think you deserve the most honest version I can give you, even if it is less clean than you might want." She sat with that for a while. She wrote back, "That is the most honest thing you have said to me. It is enough. It is more than enough. I don't need clean. I have always managed with the actual shape of things." She sent the letter. She went back to her work. The visit to Ashvale she had been planning happened in late October, when the compound was in the particular season that fell between the warmth being gone and the cold being fully arrived, and in between time, the gray gold of it. She arrived in the morning. Calder was in the compound and met her at the main entrance, which was not something he had ever done before when she had lived there. She registered the difference without making it into something it wasn't. He had made a decision about how to behave going forward, and this was part of it, and she was going to take it at face value. They sat in the council room. She asked him about her mother. He told her. He told her more than she had expected. He told her about the first year Claire Sutton Voss had been at the compound, and the ways in which the pack had not been welcoming, and the ways in which Mara's father had been the thing that made it possible to stay. He told her what Claire had been like, the specific quality of her, the way she moved through a room, the particular intelligence she had, the thing that Mara apparently had as well, and that Calder called seeing everything, by which he meant the thing that made Mara read rooms and people with the accuracy she did. He told her that her mother had known, from the day of Mara's birth, that the mark at her daughter's shoulder blade would eventually be found, that she had not been afraid of it, that she had been afraid of the finding being misused, and that the fear had shaped the decisions she made about how to raise Mara, not to hide her, but to prepare her. For what? Mara said. For having to manage it herself, Calder said, without support, in a system that wouldn't acknowledge it. He paused. She knew she wasn't going to be there. She knew the shape of her own future better than most people do. He looked at his hands. She did what she could with the time she had. Mara sat with that. She thought about every skill she had built, every patient she had sat beside, every record she had kept and every book she had read, and every morning she had gotten up and gone to the infirmary, when the alternative would have been easier. She thought about her mother's jaw in the mirror. She did well, Mara said. Yes, Calder said, she did. After she left the council room, she went to the infirmary. Nina was there. Penn was there, at the desk in the corner. Owen appeared from somewhere within the first 10 minutes, with honey this time in a larger jar, and set it on the counter without explanation. She sat on the stool. She drank tea. She was there for 3 hours, and they talked about ordinary things. Penn's training, the new supply request that Nina was trying to argue through the Pack Council, a tricky case that had come in the previous week involving a respiratory condition that neither Nina nor Penn had seen before. Mara talked through the differential with them, drawing on the Continental Medical Framework documents she had been working with, and by the end of it they had a plan, and Penn was writing it down with the focused attention of someone doing real work. When she left, the pine trees were moving in the late afternoon wind. She stood in the courtyard for a moment. She looked at the dais. She thought, I stood there. I put my hand against my back. I looked at a stranger at the edge of the room and felt something I did not understand. She thought, I understand it now. She thought, thank you. Not to the dais, not to the pack exactly, to the morning, to the particular combination of circumstances that had produced that moment, to the mark that had waited 22 years and then done exactly what it was always going to do. She walked to the gate. She walked through it. The vehicle was on the road. Ivan was waiting. The road went out from Ashvale in the direction she was going, and the trees on either side of it were the colors of the late season, gold and red and the last of the green, and the sky above them was the wide, pale sky of the territory she now lived inside of. She got in. She looked out the window as the compound disappeared behind a curve of the road. She did not look back past the curve. She looked forward. The road was long and the territory was wide, and she had a consultation report to finish, and an assembly session to prepare for, and a letter to write to Penn about the respiratory case, and a conversation to have with Calum this evening that she was looking forward to, in the specific way she looked forward to things that were becoming familiar, not with the anticipation of something new, but with the comfort of something real. She pressed her hand to her shoulder blade. The mark pulsed. She thought, there we are. She thought, let's go. The road opened ahead of her, and she was on it, and it was exactly where she was supposed to be. It always had been. She just needed the world to catch up. It had.